So, to say the world really is a much worse place without the Soviet Union is an understatement because nothing before or since has matched its accomplishments or the standard of living it provided for most of its people. But if this is true, it also begs the question, how did a system that is so good and that achieves so much still manage to collapse in 1991? And so, in this episode, we're going to look at the second half of the Soviet Union, and we're going to look at all of the major steps that happen after the Second World War that lead the Soviet Union from becoming this beacon of hope and humanity and advancement, and look at all of the stages that come after that just undermine that and ultimately lead to its collapse. And as we go through each stage, we're going to keep asking that question: how did a system that accomplished so much, that could reach that level of efficiency, manage to collapse? And collapse so quickly too. And so to begin this episode, we're going to go to our old mate, our old favorite, Michael Parenti, and I've got two quotes of his, which I think really set the stage for everything we're about to talk about. Both of them come from Black Shirts and Reds, of course, one of my favorite books, by far the most influential book I've read in the past 15 years. Let's start with quote number one. Sorely lacking within the US left is any rational evaluation of the Soviet Union, a nation that endured a protracted civil war and a multinational foreign invasion in the very first years of its existence, and that 2 decades later threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast at enormous cost to itself. In the 3 decades after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets made industrial advances equal to what capitalism took a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling their children rather than working them 14 hours a day as capitalist industrialists did, and still do in many parts of the world. End quote. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to the second Parenti quote, which is especially important for everything we're about to talk about in regards to the fall of the Soviet Union. Parenti's second quote is this: "To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did. In Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba, revolutionary communism created a life for the mass of people that was far better than a wretched existence they had endured under feudal lords, military bosses, foreign colonizers, and Western capitalists. The end result was a dramatic improvement in living conditions for hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or since witnessed in history." End quote. So again, we'll come back to that original question: how could a system that did all of this good and was clearly beloved by the people at the time, how could it go from these huge accomplishments to collapsing in very quick order and then being condemned by almost every historical source in the West? That is a spectacular fall from grace. And as we are going to see throughout this podcast, it is a very unfair one. But before we get into the fall of the Soviet Union, we should do a bit of a speed run about its rise and its accomplishments and why this was so significant and how it managed to be such a massive force for good for so many people. And in order to understand this achievement, we have to look at what Russia was like in 1917. So under the Tsar, Russia is basically it's one of the last absolute total monarchies, and it's like something out of the medieval world. It's barely progressed beyond that. The majority of Russian citizens are serfs, like they literally work for lords on land that they don't own. No one's educated. There is very, very little wealth amongst anyone but the upper class. For the first part of the 20th century, there's a lot of protests and a lot of small revolts against the Tsar. The most famous one before the actual big revolution is in 1905, when the Duma is created as a consequence of that. Like, the people are getting really riled up, so the Tsar creates this kind of symbolic parliament for people to put their grievances to the government, but it's still completely owned by the Tsar. But that showed that there was already a lot of demand for change, even as early as 1905. By the time the First World War comes around, and the First World War is devastating for Russia. They went into it thinking that they were going to be able to snap up land. And like all the major powers that went into the First World War, that was a war about colonialism. The First World War breaks out because the European powers are running out of new lands to go and colonize, so they need to start fighting each other to, well, take the colonial possessions of the other empires. And Russia has been feeling very left out of that for a long time, and they go into the First World War with the intention of snapping up, say, Germany's colonies. The big adversary, of course, that Russia has, and they've had a long feud. They've disliked each other for a long time, but it was the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire, and Turkey specifically, is like Russia's mortal enemy at this point. And Russia's really looking forward to basically carving up the Ottoman Empire and taking a lot of their land as their colonies. But fate doesn't let it play out that way, and Russia suffers terribly in the First World War. They have a really hard time trying to fight the Germans and Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, in fact. Of course, Russia won't even make it to the end of the First World War. They're the first country to tap out, and it happens because of the revolution in 1917, and then the subsequent Bolshevik Revolution from then. One of the most important moments probably of all of human history, because it's the first time socialism takes control of a major country with the intention of turning it into a communist state. And seemingly there's nothing stopping them from doing that. Once the revolution has happened and the Bolsheviks are in power, it seems like there's not really anything that's going to stop them from accomplishing their communist dream. That is, of course, until only a year later when the Civil War breaks out. And the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, is a result of the monarchists that have been deposed. Of course, the Tsar and his family have all been killed by this point, but there's a lot of people in the monarchist faction and the landowners and all the very rich people in Russia that have a lot to lose by the idea of, having their wealth redistributed. They're not a big fan of that. So they go to all the other big capitalist major powers and they get help and they get funding from them, and they launch a civil war to try and destroy the Soviets altogether. All the capitalist countries have huge fingerprints all over the Russian Civil War. America will bankroll the White Forces, the White Army, which is the monarchist army. So will Britain, so will France, so will Germany. A lot of countries that are terrified by the idea of socialism and communism. All of the rich people, all the landowners, they're terrified by this idea and they want it destroyed on the spot. This is a theme you may have noticed goes all the way through the 20th and even right here in the 21st century. Capitalists are terrified of socialism and communism specifically because it does work, and that's why they spend so much money destroying socialist and communist governments, and why they spend billions of dollars every year on propaganda trying to convince everyone that socialism and communism are evil. And I guess the very first time you really see that play out is right here in 1918 in the Russian Civil War. And it'll go for a few years. It goes until 1921. About 12 million people will be dead by the end of it. But ultimately, the Soviets will be successful. During the Civil War, the Soviets will also found the Comintern, which is the Communist International, which is a pretty loose alliance of every communist community around the world. And the Soviets are basically saying, well, let's help bankroll them. If the capitalists want to bankroll the revolution against us, well, two can play at this game, and we can help fund communist uprisings in other countries as well. And so that's like one of their first big achievements. The Comintern is quite successful, and it will have a profound impact on all global geopolitics for the entire 20th century. It's during the Civil War that you really see just how efficient and powerful socialism really is. Because if a capitalist country was plunged into a civil war, as I'm sure we're going to see with America any day now, The priority is always about just the war itself and making sure that rich people stay rich. That's always the top priority. But even during the Civil War, and this is absolutely the lowest point in Soviet history, like this is the point where they don't even know if they're going to survive. Like the White Russian forces are very strong at the start of this war and they're doing a lot of damage. And the question of who's going to win the Civil War is not a foregone conclusion. It really could go either way at the start. But in 1919, so only a year into the war, the Soviets launched their first big campaign, which is the mass literacy and schooling campaign. And it goes across the entire country. And this whole campaign is designed to bring everyone universal education and to modernize the entire education system, which honestly under the Tsar barely existed as it was. And the Soviets will launch this massive literacy program, and it's hugely successful. Within the scope of only a couple of years, almost the entire country will learn how to read and write. And they do this during the Civil War, which is just insanely impressive. Toward the end of the Civil War, so in about 1920, the Soviets will also launch their electrification plan, which is the first stage towards the mass industrialization of the country. Its whole intention is just to bring electricity to every town in the entire country in preparation for building industrialization on top of that later. And again, this is 1920, so this is during the Civil War. They're starting to do this. This is a level of efficiency you would never see under a capitalist government. As soon as the Civil War ends in 1921, the Soviets roll out the NEP, which is the new economic policy, which is aimed to just stabilize every single part of the Soviet economy. So it's about the state taking control of everything, taking control of the actual industry itself, production, banking, trade, everything, even at like a marketplace level, all the way up to the high level strategic, 5-year plans that are soon going to come. And again, this policy is amazing. And if you hear a capitalist talk about this, they're like, well, look at how the Soviets just control every part of your life. And they're, it's a dictatorship and it's authoritarian and you're not allowed to do anything. And I like to say, well, yeah, but look at the intention of things like the NEP. The intention was to improve, stabilize, and build the economy for everyone. And it's hugely successful in that role. And as Michael Parenti pointed out in our opening quote, the Soviet Union will accomplish in only a few decades what capitalist countries took centuries to do. And that's why you do it. When you have a planned economy, when you don't just, instead of just letting a couple of capitalists own all of the industry and their only intention is just to make money. And if anything in society actually develops, well, that's just a pleasant side effect. And that's why places like Britain take like 100 years after colonialism starts before they even start industrializing, because the rich people didn't care until then. They were making enough money just from raw resource harvesting and slavery that they didn't need to industrialize or make a more advanced economy. It's only when the money starts drying up from that and those contradictions start tightening there that they start evolving their industry, because that's the only way they can make more money. But under a socialist system, so in the Soviet Union, everything is planned right from the start. They're sitting there going, okay, this is the end point we want to get to. We want to make sure everyone has a house, everyone's educated, everyone has food, everyone has public transport, etc., etc. And with that intention at the beginning of their economic plan, they can just cut straight to the point. And that's why they're so efficient and why they're able to achieve in only a couple of years what capitalist countries take 100 years to accomplish. It's very, very impressive. In 1922, one of the most under-talked about accomplishments of the Soviet Union happens. It was a program called indigenization. Now that the Soviet Union has been successfully established in Russia, they recognize that in order for the revolution to spread to all of their neighboring countries, they can't just impose Russian socialism on them. It has to come with a focus on the local languages and the local cultures of all the countries you want to expand it to. The revolution has to focus on the issues and the cultures and the things that really matter to these countries specifically. It has to be tailored for them in order for it to take off. And so this program of indigenization is created to promote local languages and to promote cadres in these areas to help roll out socialism with a lot more legitimacy because it focuses on the issues of specific nationalities. And this will prove to be a very important step, and it will work very closely with the whole idea of the Comintern and supporting international communist organizations. And then in 1924, the Soviet Union hits its next really big issue. It's a pretty big issue because Lenin dies, and it pumps the brakes on the rapid industrialization programs that were already in the works as the succession crisis sets in. There are only two candidates that everyone is really taking seriously, which is Lev Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Stalin, of course, will win in the end. And these two particular leaders have very different views about how socialism should be spread across the world. Trotsky believed that they basically just need to launch revolutions across the world immediately and just overthrow everything. The people will naturally rise up against capitalism. We're all just going to have this big global revolution and everyone's going to win, and that'll be the end of capitalism, and then everyone can just join together and go straight to communism. Stalin has a lot more of a realistic view of the situation, and his view is that we should stabilize the Soviet Union first, and then we expand the revolution to the rest of the world. And this mindset really does shape how the Soviet Union will develop over the next couple of decades, because Stalin is all about consolidation and strengthening their position and rapidly industrializing everything, because Stalin is under no illusions that the moment the capitalists will have any chance of destroying the Soviet Union, they will do so. And he is absolutely right about this, as only about 15 years after this, the biggest war in human history will be fought trying to destroy the Soviet Union. So the fact that Stalin takes over and immediately hits the ground running to turn the Soviet Union into the biggest, most powerful industrial superpower in the world, in my mind, is completely justified and vindicated by everything that happens after. Nonetheless, so in the late 1920s, so 1927, 1928, Stalin's all about just tightening everything up. He's launching the 5-year plans, which are great too. I love the 5-year plans. Are such a brilliant idea, and there's a reason China to this day they still do them. The way a 5-year plan works, if you don't know, is you basically set a really ambitious goal. In this case, in the first 5-year plan, the Soviet Union, it's about industrializing and electrifying the entire country. That's a massive project. That is something that realistically is going to take a lot more than 5 years to do. But it doesn't matter. By setting that goal, and it's an outrageously ambitious goal, and telling everyone, let's work our absolute best to achieve it, even if you don't completely hit the goal, you'll still get everyone working so hard that they're going to make massive accomplishments in that area and huge progress towards that goal. And it's a very efficient way to run an economy, by telling basically everyone in the country, this is our goal for the next 5 years. Let's all come together and find a way to get it done. It's very effective and it works very well. And Stalin's 5-year plans will completely transform Russia and the Soviet Union into an economic superpower. In 1929, they will also launch the agricultural revolution, which looks to completely overhaul the way food is created in the Soviet Union. Instead of just letting people have their little tenanted farms, they want to just collectivize these farms, so bring them all together, have mass mobilization and urbanization around these farms, so you can build basically entire towns around massive farmland and get everyone working on it together to just maximize that output. And long term, this is a great idea, and when it is fully implemented, it creates an amount of surplus food which it feeds not just the Soviet Union basically forever, but they have enough food that they can send it around the world and feed people as well. A lot of this will go to a lot of colonized countries that are being exploited, and it's a way of the Soviet Union proving that, we actually care about you. You should come and join socialism and, overthrow your capitalist colonial overlords. The Soviet Union will produce so much food that that's not a problem for them. They can give food to anyone who needs it. The problem is the actual implementation of the agricultural revolution was too enthusiastic initially. One of the big criticisms of the Soviet Union is the famine in Ukraine, which does kill millions of people. And that is an absolute disaster. The plans were far too enthusiastic for the reality of what they could do. But I can understand how you would get to that mind frame, because look at everything they've already achieved. They've all been spectacular successes up to this point. But disrupting the food supply and not properly preparing for that initial phase of having the farms go down before you've set up the collectivized farms is a disaster. But unlike capitalism, there's a disaster from capitalism every single year, right? Like, we did the podcast a while back about the 10 most evil companies, and I can point to like 100 massive capitalist disasters that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and capitalists not only don't admit that anything was wrong, they never pay any reparations for it, they learn no lessons, they don't care because the money still comes in. One of the really interesting things when you look at the agricultural revolution in Russia and in China is the fact that there is huge investigations into what went wrong after, and the lessons are actually learned and the lessons are implemented, and they never happen again. So yeah, there is this disaster error when it first starts, but once the lessons are learned, those disasters never happen again. And the agricultural revolution, when fully implemented, is one of the greatest achievements in all of human history. And it's important to remember that when talking about this entire era. The late 1920s and early 1930s is hallmarked by Stalin's near obsession with national security. He will tighten the reins everywhere. The commissars and the secret police, the NKVD, which would later become the KGB, gain a lot of power during this time, and they will start running the Soviet Union on a very tight leash. And Stalin gets a lot of criticism for this, because if you look at it on the surface, it's like, well, yes, this is clearly dictatorship. How is this any different to, say, Hitler or Mussolini or Franco? He's basically a fascist, right? But not really, because you need to look again at the intentions. And Stalin himself frequently gives speeches and gives talks to the Central Committee talking about why they are doing this. And that part is always omitted from Western sources. But Stalin's logic is sound, and it's very sound, especially in my mind, to why he's doing this, because he's not doing it to consolidate his own power within the party. He's doing it for the survival of socialism itself. And in order to understand this, you need to look at the global context of everything that's happening here. Because look at the rest of the world. While Stalin is industrializing, educating, and housing the Soviet Union, the Great Depression has hit by this point, and capitalism is in crisis all across the world. The Trotskyists, who are still around at this point, Trotsky himself has fled, but the Trotskyists are still all over the Soviet Union. And to them, they're like, look how weak capitalism is becoming. Let's go strike now. Let's go and take the initiative. We can spread the revolution. But Stalin has a much more sober approach to this. And again, as events will unfold, I think you'll be vindicated by this. He's saying, no, this is capitalism becoming its most dangerous form, because when capitalism starts being threatened, and as all the rich people are losing money as a result of this Great Depression, they're going to become more dangerous. And this is when capitalism starts to empower fascism to restore it. If you want to learn more about like that whole dynamic, I made the episode What is Fascism a while back. It's a great one to go visit to learn this dynamic about how that works. But in a nutshell, when capitalists and industrialists in capitalist countries start losing money, they go and fund fascist parties to take control of a country to make sure that their capital interests are protected at all times. Because remember, when capitalist economies start getting bad, as we are currently living through right now, this minute, the cost of living is getting out of control, petrol's unaffordable, houses are unaffordable, everything's getting really bad. And if you're a worker, you're sitting there going, fuck this shit, it's time for a big change. And the capitalists know that too. All the billionaires today know this. And that's why they turn to fascism. That's why they fund fascism and fascists, because they are a brutal paramilitary force that can stand between the billionaires and the bourgeoisie and the industrialists and the capitalists, and stand between them and the workers that are becoming angry. And fascism's job is to beat the people back into subservience of capital. That's what fascism is always doing. And going back to 1930s, Stalin sees this clearly. He sees how dangerous the rest of the world is, and he comes to the conclusion that this is the time that the capitalist countries are most likely to come and attack the Soviet Union. And he even recognizes that we aren't strong enough yet to survive that. So he really doubles down on all the national security and the industrialization. They double time the production of these factories. And these factories are there to build everything the Soviet needs to achieve autarky, which is, to make sure that they can produce everything they need for their survival within the country itself. So they're building things like lots of steel plants. They're setting up lots of new iron mines. They're looking for oil everywhere they can, getting all of these strategic resources so that they can build a lot of weapons, so that they can train a big army, so that they can defend the Soviet Union against the attacks that are to come. In 1938, Stalin, and I'm always just saying Stalin, but it's not just one person. Like Stalin, when I'm saying Stalin, I'm basically talking about the Central Committee in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of people behind these decisions. It's not just him, but it's much easier to just put his name on it for simplicity purposes. So Stalin, which is the Soviet Central Committee, in 1938, they can see a rift starting to form between the capitalist democracies, so places like Britain, France, the United States, and the fascist governments that are forming. It's Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and fascist Spain, and fascist Japan. Although it's not really fair to call Japan fascist. They're a lot more complicated than that. Japan is also a absolute monarchy that's also a democracy, but it's also run by the military. But the military is owned by all these industrial zaibatsus, so it's actually kind of hard to understand who's in charge of Japan. We'll do a whole episode on them soon. Nonetheless, the Japanese are throwing their lot in with the fascists, so for all intents and purposes, they're on the same side. All the fascist forces have also signed the Anti-Comintern Pact by this point, which basically says if one of these fascist countries is attacked by the Soviet Union, all of them will declare war on the Soviet Union in turn. This really lets their motivations be known, and it's important to note, very, very important to note, that fascism's main goal is to destroy socialism. That's why the capitalists and the industrialists and the bourgeoisie gave these fascists all this money to begin with, all this support. The reason Hitler comes to power is all of these very rich industrialists, people that own BMW, the people that own IG Farben, Krupp, Rheinmetall, all these big industrialists, they're the ones who fund Hitler and get him to power. He didn't get to power because he was popular with the people. He got to power because he had millions and millions of francs funding his rise. It was very, very easy to take control of a country when you have all the wealth of that country backing your political campaigns, which is one of the reasons why people like Trump come to power in the US. He didn't get to power because he's popular. He got to power because he was backed by all the billionaires. Anyway, fascism's main goal as a result is to destroy socialism, because that's what the capitalists fear. All these industrialists do not want these workers taking control, seizing the means of production, and basically doing to them what the Soviets did to the Russian bourgeoisie. That's their biggest fear. So they fund fascists to destroy socialism. That's the whole point. So predictably, the fascists are starting to get a lot more anti-communist with their rhetoric and their intentions. Stalin sees this as well. And as the rift between the democratic capitalists and the fascist capitalists begins to rise, Stalin sees an opportunity to get between that wedge. And as Hitler starts to become a lot more aggressive on the European continent, by this point he has remilitarized the Rhineland, which is the demilitarized zone between Germany and France, which is there for France's protection. German forces are there now. They've already annexed Austria by this point, the Anschluss. So Austria and Germany are now one nation. And by this point in the story, in 1938, the Munich crisis is happening. Hitler is again demanding that basically the whole border area of Czechoslovakia, which is full of people of German descent, should be rejoined with Germany. And this is a huge crisis because this has to be the red line. And the capitalist democracies really hit their limit with Hitler by this point. And this is when the real wedge between the fascists and the other capitalists starts to form. And Stalin capitalizes on that. So when the Munich conference occurs, which is all these powers coming together to find a way to resolve this without a war breaking out, because that's, these are all the survivors of the First World War, and everyone is terrified of a Second World War breaking out because a lot of the people at the negotiating table were in the trenches of the First World War, and obviously they're very traumatized and no one wants to see that happen again. Except Hitler, of course. He loved the trenches, by the way. But they're trying to stop this war, and the Soviet Union sees an opportunity here. So Stalin is already talking to both France and Britain, going, hey, we are happy to get involved in this too. We can help you form a united front against Hitler. But all these capitalist forces hate the communists. They hate socialists because they have the same fear. All of the capitalists in Britain also have a terrible fear of a socialist uprising throughout Britain and them losing their position and the workers seizing the means of production and seizing all of their factories there. So they refuse to deal with the communists. And Stalin will have numerous failed attempts of trying to get some kind of non-aggression pact or a defensive pact with France and Britain against Hitler, because Stalin also sees him as being the biggest threat to the Soviet Union at this point. So France and Britain completely reject this. The Munich conference goes absolutely terribly. Everyone loses face. No one gets what they want except Hitler. And then Hitler ends up just annexing all of Czechoslovakia anyway without anyone firing a shot. And so Stalin is in a very interesting diplomatic position at this point, because Hitler, who never misses an opportunity to talk about how much he wants to destroy the Soviet Union and crush communism the world over, he's getting really, really strong by this point. But the Democratic Capitalist Alliance, the Allies, do not want to work with the Soviet Union. So what does Stalin do? Look at it from his point of view at this point. What would you do in this situation? This superpower that hates you is building up its army on your border. And Stalin comes up with a very simple solution of, well, let's make friends with them then. And this is when the very famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact happens, named after the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and Germany. And they basically agree that they will joint invade Poland, divide it amongst themselves, and then they will have a defensive alliance with each other and a friendship alliance, and we'll start trading, we'll start becoming friends, and then that frees up Germany's eastern border from any threat, and they can go and destroy France and Britain in peace. Meanwhile, it gives the Soviet Union enough time to keep building up their forces to defend their country as well. So it's a mutually beneficial pact for both of these countries. And the way the Soviets see it is it's also a way for us to half liberate Poland. This is also a constant criticism that is used against the Soviet Union, and people are saying the Soviet Union is this imperialist force because, look, they're acting just like Hitler. Literally, they're both invading Poland at the same time. But again, you need to look at the context, and you need to look at the reality of what that was like on the ground, because these two powers will treat the Polish people in very, very different ways. The Soviets will move into the Soviet Union with the idea of liberating the workers and spreading communist theory to the Polish people and integrating them into the Union, and they will do exactly that. Meanwhile, the Germans, when they take over their half of Poland, they don't even set up a puppet government. For them, Poland is an entity to be completely dismantled and destroyed. It will be the site for the vast majority of Germany's concentration camps for the next couple of years. Millions of people will die under the German occupation of Poland. These are not comparable things in my mind. In 1939, the Winter War will also break out, which is the Soviet invasion of Finland. I don't want to go too deep into this right now for a couple of reasons. One, we're going to start getting very off track if I don't actually start getting to post-World War II Russia soon. I've been doing this for over an hour already, and I'm still just laying the context for what I want to talk about today. So if I keep going on these tangents, we're never going to go anywhere. But I do promise we are going to talk about the Winter War soon. I think Finland would be a great country to do a whole video on very soon. So we'll park the bus on that one for now. I will just have a quick comment on that and say that in my mind, that's actually one of the biggest mistakes Stalin ever makes, is the invasion of Finland, for a few reasons. The optics of it are terrible. For one, I think the intention was always to just create that buffer state between Finland and Russia, and they have their own really big contentious history. And Stalin can see that the Finns are already starting to get in bed with the Nazis by this point, and so they share a huge border, by the way. Finland and Russia share a big border, and the fear that eventually fascist armies would come through Finland to invade the Soviet Union is something on the Central Committee's mind, Stalin's especially. And again, he'll be vindicated for this later, because Finland will join the Second World War on the Nazi side, and the entire Northern Front will be a huge part of this war. Nonetheless, the way that situation, that crisis was handled, was not Stalin's finest hour. But again, we will dig into that in more detail in the actual Finland episode. By 1941, the geopolitical situation for the Soviet Union, they've got the Axis forces occupying their entire border. Since the invasion of Poland, the Nazis have taken over pretty much all of Europe by this point. They've invaded Denmark, Norway. The Nazis have taken over everything. Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. They've invaded Yugoslavia, Albania, Greece. The only countries left in Europe that haven't been invaded by the Nazis have now decided that it's safer to just join their alliance. The only other exception, of course, is Switzerland, completely amoral bank of the Second World War. They'll take money from anyone, especially the Nazis. And it's a nice little buffer state that everyone can use to hide their ill-gotten gains. So much money will flow into Switzerland's stolen wealth from all the countries that the Nazis invade, and that's one of the reasons why the Nazis will leave them alone. They're a place to go and launder all of that stolen wealth. Anyway, that also deserves its whole other episode, so let's not linger on that. By March 1941, the Nazis have almost completely finished taking over Western and Central Europe. They're wrapping up the last few battles in Yugoslavia and Greece by this point. And Hitler is now become very, very confident in the power of his armies, the Wehrmacht. They have been growing steadily since 1938, and to this point have never known really any serious defeat. They have invaded and easily conquered every country on their hit list. And Hitler decides now's the time to invade the Soviet Union and destroy his mortal enemy for good. And in March 1941, he starts building up his army along the Soviet border. And it's not just his army, of course. The Romanians are there, the Hungarians are there. Italy will even send some divisions. So will the rehabilitated fascist forces of France, the Netherlands, even Norway. Everyone will be sending divisions, and they start building up this massive army. More than 3.3 million soldiers start building up along the Soviet border. And Stalin sees this. He is very aware that this force is building up, but he has, of course, an open channel with Hitler himself, and they're constantly talking, and Stalin's like, well, what are you doing there? And Hitler's saying, well, the British have started bombing, they're sending bombers now into Europe, and I'm just moving the army over to the east where it's safe, so it's out of range of British bombers, and we can just do our training exercises there as we get ready to invade Britain itself. And Stalin is suspicious of this. He's a pretty switched on guy, Stalin, and he can see that this doesn't quite add up. But he's also aware that the Soviet Union is not yet ready to go to war with Germany. And you got to remember that the Germany of 1941 is infinitely stronger than the Germany of 1938. Remember, Stalin was ready to join France and Britain in a war against Nazi Germany in 1938, and he was ready to do it then. But because that didn't work out, and France has been defeated since Britain is isolated, and now the Nazis, having taken over all of Europe, are much, much bigger and much more powerful, and almost on parity with the standing forces of the Soviet Union itself. So a war between these two countries is really not in Stalin's interest at this point. He's still trying to placate Hitler however he can. He will increase the trade between their two countries in the interest of just trying to buy more time to keep building up the Soviet forces themselves. The Soviets also have another big thorn in their side at this point, which is Japan. We'll do a whole episode on Japan soon because it deserves, their side of the story is so interesting and needs a lot of time dedicated to it. But the short version is the Japanese government has completely lost control of their biggest army, which is in Manchukuo, big air quotes. That's what the Japanese puppet government in Manchuria. And their army's completely out of control. It doesn't listen to the Japanese government, and it's just out there taking up land wherever it can, mainly against China. And that's what's going to kick off the Second Sino-Japanese War, which by this point in the story has already started. But there are border clashes between the Soviet Union and this out-of-control Japanese army all the time. And there's a Russian general named Georgy Zhukov who will be one of the most important people in this entire story going forward. And he's the guy in charge of the Soviet forces in the East. He will win some pretty big, spectacular battles against the Japanese forces, especially the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, which is, it's crazy. Like, remember, these countries are not at war. So Japan and the Soviet Union are not at war, and they fight this massive battle, like tanks, planes, everything. Tens of thousands are dead by the end of it, and this isn't even a war. Like, this is just a, again, massive air quotes, border clash. But nonetheless, the Soviet Union is very concerned about Japan because they are out of control, and the army in Manchukuo. I need to stop doing the air quotes. There's too many of them. But the Japanese army in Manchukuo on the Soviet border is it's the biggest army Japan will ever field. There's over 1 million people strong. So you've got this huge Japanese army on the eastern border of the Soviet Union, and you've got this massive German army building up on the western border. The Soviets are very concerned here, and they're doing everything they can to keep the peace. Another very important thing to point out at this point is the Soviet spy network is massive. That's one of the things that Stalin also built up. The Soviets probably have the best personnel-based spy network in the entire world. Like, the British get a lot of credit for having like these amazing cryptologists. You know, they're able to break the German codes and intercept messages and things like that. Alan Turing and the early computing machines being used to break German codes, which is very impressive. But the Soviets have the best intelligence network in the world because at this point, you know, there are communists all over the world, and a lot of them have been absorbed into the Comintern, and they are giving intelligence directly to the Soviet government. A lot of spies in Europe are all telling this network the same thing, that the Germans are about to invade the Soviet Union. And this news is reaching Stalin directly. Central Committee can see Germans are planning to invade very soon. But Stalin refuses to act on this, and he has his own little personal quirk for why he won't do this. Because if you remember in 1938, he wanted to join France and Britain in an alliance against the Germans, and they rejected it. But then when the war broke out and France went down and Britain is standing alone, Churchill has been spending every opportunity he possibly can to get the Soviets and the Nazis fighting each other, because as far as Churchill's concerned, that's to his advantage no matter what, because if the fascists and the communists destroy each other, then Churchill doesn't have to worry about either of them. So having his two mortal enemies go to war with each other is his great outcome. And he spends a lot of effort trying to convince the Soviets to go to war with the Germans. And Stalin is very pissed off by this because, again, he's like, well, we offered to help you get rid of these Nazis back when it mattered. Now look at the situation, and it's so much worse now, and it's not to our advantage. And he feels that all of these spy messages coming into into the Soviet Union are like British ploys, because the British are famous for their ploys. They have a big intelligence network as well. And he's like, they're just trying to get a war to break out between the Soviets and the Germans so that we can do Britain's fighting for them. So Stalin refuses to listen to these notifications. He's convinced himself that he's right here. Like, that, no, this is all false reports. And then on June 22nd, 1941, the Germans invade the Soviet Union. It is the biggest invasion in human history. Again, more than 3 million German and Allied troops will cross the border, and it will launch the biggest war in human history. And that's something I think a lot of people don't get their head around either. Because if you take the Eastern Front of the Second World War, which is just the war between the Axis and the Soviet Union, so Germany and the Soviet Union, that war alone is bigger than the entirety of the First World War. If you take it out of the context of the Second World War, it's still the biggest war in human history. It's absolutely massive. And again, slight tangent. I've got a lot of them this episode, don't I? But the Second World War is my particular area of expertise. I think I've probably mentioned numerous times in this podcast. And I need to be careful with this part of the story, because if you guys let me, I will just talk about the Second World War for the next 10 hours without a break. And we'll be here all day. So I'm going to make a conscious effort to not talk about the Second World War. We're going to basically skip over it so that we can get to the whole topic of this podcast, which is the fall of the Soviet Union. So I'm just going to sum up the Second World War, the Eastern Front, what the Germans call the Ostfront, and what the Soviet Union calls the Great Patriotic War. It is the biggest war in human history. So many people will die in this war that we don't even have a clear estimation of how many people die in it. The sources range dramatically. The low end puts the total dead at like 20 million people. The high end puts it at 60 million people. Let's just split the difference here and say 40 million people will die in this war. Even if that is a massive, massive exaggeration, it's still insane. And the war is devastating. It's especially devastating for the Soviet Union because the majority of this war will be fought on Soviet land. Remember, the Germans have invaded them, and they are crushing Soviet towns, Soviet cities. They are encircling Soviet armies. They are killing millions of people. And the Germans, their whole intention here is Lebensraum. They're here to colonize Eastern Europe and into the Asian continent proper. Their plan is to basically kill everyone in the Soviet Union, and then German colonists can come and take the land. One of the reasons Hitler is held in such evil regard, especially amongst Europeans in the West, is Hitler is just doing what Europeans have always done in terms of colonization, but he's doing it against other European people, which is why he's so evil. But Hitler is no worse than any of the other European dictators. The things King Leopold II of Belgium, for example, did in Congo easily match Hitler's accomplishments in terms of war crimes and horror and genocide. So does the entire history of Britain, France, and Spain. So Hitler is no worse than any of them. The only difference is his victims are white. So he gets a higher position in terms of historical importance in Western narratives. Anyway, the war, when it first breaks out, and again, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the war itself, but just the really important and really interesting points, right? Which to me is all of it, but I'll do my best. The war goes really, really badly for the Soviet Union in that first 6 months. And when the Germans invade, Stalin actually demotes himself. He goes, fuck, I fucked up. And he goes to his dacha and basically resigns and says, yeah, I've made the biggest mistake. You can basically execute me if you want to. I've made a really big fuck up here. And it will be the Stavka, which is the Soviet high command, military high command. They're the ones who will go to his dacha and go, Stalin, we actually really want you back because overall you're a pretty good leader. And yes, you've definitely messed up, but we need you right now. This is the most crucial moment in all of our history. Get your ass back to this office and get back to work. And he does. That's the Triploi version of that story, by the way, but it's pretty accurate. So Stalin is reinstated to power. Things are going really badly at first. They're losing armies left, right, and center because, again, the Germans are this massive army and they have been fighting victory after victory by this point for nearly 3 years. They started their war in 1939 and it's 1941 now, and they've just been going victory to victory to victory. The Soviets don't have anywhere near that combat experience and they're getting slaughtered by these very veteran German troops. As these armies are getting destroyed, the Soviets remembered that their best army, the only army that actually has any combat experience, is over on the border with the Japanese, which is where, until this point, most of their fighting and most of the danger has been coming from. The troops over there are actual, like, Arctic trained troops. These are guys made for tundra warfare, for winter warfare. They've got the best equipment, they've got the best experience, and they're led by the Soviets' best general, which is Georgy Zhukov. The problem is they can't leave their post because the Japanese look like they're going to attack. The reason I'm spending a bit of detail talking about this point is I've got a very interesting anecdotal story to share, and I've been looking for the best place to put it into any podcast or video, to be honest. And it brings us back to this Soviet spy network, which is everywhere, right? Including within Japan. And in November 1941, so it's a couple of months into the German invasion, a bunch of communist spies in Japan, which are in the Imperial Palace, find out Japan's plans to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor, to destroy the US fleet at Pearl Harbor, and then invade the duchies so Indonesia and Malaysia, and take all the oil there. And hopefully that's enough for them to win their war against China. Things are not going well for Japan, so that's their massive Hail Mary play for how we might possibly win our war against China. The point being that these Soviet spies know that Pearl Harbor is about to happen, and they relay that information to Stalin. They don't give it to anyone else. They don't even tell the Americans, but they tell Stalin, and Stalin then approaches the Japanese government and says, hey, I have a feeling you guys are going to be pretty busy soon, wink wink. Do you want to sign a friendship agreement, a non-aggression pact, so we don't have to have any fighting between our two countries? We're obviously busy with the Germans. You're going to be busy with everyone very, very soon. So let's have this non-aggression pact, and you can move your armies away from our border and we can move our armies away from our border. The Japanese, of course, agree to this. The Soviets go out of their way to make sure they do not relay this information to the Americans. They want Pearl Harbor to happen because if Pearl Harbor happens, that gets rid of the Japanese threat for the Soviet Union. I could actually do a whole podcast just on the incredible stuff the Soviet spy network does, but that is a whole other tangent. We'll do a video on that later. Once that friendship is signed and the entire Soviet Eastern armies can then move over and fight the Germans, and this is when the winter is starting to set in and everything for the Germans is starting to bog down because they really underestimated just how friggin' big the Soviet Union is. And when those autumn rains come and everything turns to mud and their tanks are getting stuck, their trucks are getting stuck, and their whole offensive is just slowing down. Well, at the same time, although the Soviets don't have as much combat experience of them and they're getting smashed and they're disorganized, there's this thing that happens with Russians in war, and you see it in every single war, where if they go on the offensive, they tend to not do very well. So think the First World War or the aforementioned Winter War against Finland. The Soviets and Russians just don't have much enthusiasm when they have to go and attack and invade another country. Honestly, you see the same thing in Ukraine war right now. They have very little enthusiasm about invading other countries. But the opposite is true when you invade Russia. When Russia gets invaded, Russians become ferocious and they are defending their country with every last drop of blood, and it is slowing down the German war machine as they just have guerrilla warfare everywhere. There are partisans everywhere. There are guys just blowing up train tracks behind the German lines. Everyone on the front line is doing their absolute best with everything they have, and they're frequently fighting to the last man. And of course, this is the Soviet Union. They're also fighting to the last woman. The Germans were not expecting that. In fact, that's another thing that catches the Germans completely off guard when they're doing their estimations for invading the Soviet Union, and they estimate that based on the Soviet Union's population, they can field about 20 million men in the field. The problem is these fascists, who are very patriarchal, could never even imagine the idea that the Soviets might put women into the military. So the German estimation for the Soviet war machine is off by half. There's actually 40 million people the Soviets can put into the field because they have gender equality and women are allowed to join the military, and they will be some of the most ferocious fighters of this entire war, which is just a great little bit of poetic justice against the patriarchal fascists, isn't it? Anyway, let's not get bogged down in World War II details, Triploi. Let's get back on topic. So, let's just cut to the end of this war now, or I will be here all day. So the Soviets win. Spoiler alert, Soviets will win this war in the end, and the Soviet Union will have its army go all the way to Berlin. The Red Army will control everything west of Berlin. So they will control large parts of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, all of the countries that will soon be part of the Warsaw Pact. And I think the end of the Second World War is the truest testament to just how efficient the planned economy and communism really are. Because this is the second time a devastating war has been fought in Russia, and since they became communist. And in both instances, not only did they survive the war, but they managed to actually grow and expand and become stronger during it. And again, remember, most of this war was fought in Soviet territory. Not only is there at least 20 million Soviet citizens dead by the end of this war, entire cities have been destroyed, like Kiev and Leningrad. A whole bunch of those collectivized farms have been devastated and destroyed and burnt out. The entire railway system has been shattered and destroyed by the retreating German armies. There's a massive housing crisis, obviously, because so much of the fighting has been happening in these cities. Stalingrad is an absolute wrecked ruin as well. You know, these are all things that have to be fixed immediately, because now that the war is over, there is a huge reconstruction program that needs to be undertaken. And under Stalin's leadership, they jump right to that task. Whenever you hear people talking about like brutalist architecture and Soviet architecture, and you see those pictures of like these endless rows of massive drab grey apartment blocks that just look oppressive, depressing, and it's often used by capitalists to say, oh, look how depressing Soviet architecture is. Again, this is missing the entire point, as capitalists always do when they talk about any of the Soviet accomplishments, because all of those apartment blocks were whipped up after the Second World War in order to house millions of homeless people, and they did it really, really fast. Rather than looking at it at the aesthetic of them and going, gee, aren't these ugly, I marvel at the fact that they were able to knock up apartments for millions of people in only a couple of years and give their entire population warm, safe, affordable housing. That is a huge accomplishment that no capitalist country would ever undertake. If that happened in a capitalist country, they would leave all their people to freeze and die. And victory for the Soviet Union in the Second World War is a total vindication, at least in my mind, of everything Stalin did, because he had incredible foresight to see that the capitalist forces would eventually attack the Soviet Union. And I don't think even he saw the fact that it would be the biggest war in human history. But not only did the Soviet Union survive that war, but completely victorious in it. And all of the decisions that Stalin laid in the 20s and 30s to heavily industrialize the country, to increase security, to increase that spy network, to even take away a lot of the liberties of the people, to focus on the security and the stabilization of the socialist state, are completely vindicated, because if they hadn't been done, the Soviet Union is a German colony today, and everyone in that nation is dead or being used as slave labor. It was only the leadership of Stalin that allowed them to endure that crisis, survive it, and come out the other end even stronger. And Stalin himself, he had a big victory address to the Soviet Union. And an important little part of that is this quote. So this is a direct quote from Stalin now. "The great sacrifices we have made for the freedom and independence of our country, the incalculable privation and suffering our people have endured during the war, our intense labors in the rear and at the front have not been in vain. They have been crowned by complete victory over the enemy." And in the post-war Soviet Union, you see Stalin become particularly, I want to use the right word here, hard about his views on everything. There is a hardness to the Soviet Union under his leadership, and he doesn't take any shit anywhere. He doesn't accept any threats anywhere. This is often portrayed in the West as paranoia, but I think it's pretty warranted considering everything they've gone through. And that's another thing you really have to take into context when you look at the way the leadership in the Stalin era plays out in the Soviet Union, because it's easy for people in the West and easy for Trotskyists to say that they would have done things a lot better. You know, Stalin was too hard. Stalin was too dictatorial. Stalin was, he's crushing free speech and he's taking away liberties. And look at life under his rule. It's so hard. But the thing about people in the West and Trotskyists is they are free to make these criticisms because they didn't have to do any of this. Stalin did. Stalin had to actually do this, and this is the way it gets done. And there is no way the Soviet Union survives the Second World War without that hardness in the leadership. And another stat I like to throw out and remind people about just how hard the war was on the Soviet Union. Whenever you hear Western narratives of the Second World War, they love to quote and talk about Operation Overlord, which is the Allied invasion of France in 1944, the liberation of France, and particularly the D-Day landings. And it's a sobering battle, that one, because in just a couple of days, the Western Allies lose 20,000 troops in Operation Overlord in just the first couple of days, and that is a huge number. It's a huge number to the Western powers, because if you go over to the Eastern Front in Russia, they're losing 20,000 people a week, every week after week after week. That's just a standard day in the Eastern Front. Again, 20 million dead at least for the Soviet Union in that war. That's more than all of the casualties for every single Western nation, including Germany, combined. They suffer immensely in this war. Stalin's paranoia, I think, is a very unfair view of this, because he was right about all of the enemies that he pointed out, and taking a hard line against them to defend the people's government in the Soviet Union, I think, is completely warranted. It's also important to point out that Stalin himself freely admits all of the errors he made during this war, which is not something you ever hear dictators do. You would never hear Hitler ever admit to doing something wrong, and he made a ton of bad decisions, all of them in fact, throughout his entire career. But Stalin he freely admitted to many errors, especially at the start of the war. That first year of the war, he freely admitted could have been handled a lot better. But he also pointed out that one of the reasons the Soviet Union was able to beat the fascists was the fact that the people had so much confidence in the Soviet government itself. Again, something that the Western histories rarely point out. In fact, here's a direct quote from Stalin himself, and he said, "This confidence of the Russian people in the Soviet government proved to be the decisive force which ensured the historic victory over the enemy of humanity, over fascism." One of the massive advantages of having a socialist government is the fact that it can openly learn from mistakes. And this is something that really happened, especially under Stalin's reign. He freely admitted to mistakes and looked to fix them. One of the best examples of that is the way the war was actually run, and looking at the differences, the way the war was run between the fascist government in Germany and the Soviet government. And you'll notice that they actually kind of switch the ways they run the war as the tide starts to turn. For example, when the war starts, Hitler basically trusts the entire war to his generals. He has a whole bunch of very capable generals. He basically just lets them make all the decisions and run the war however they wish, and they start doing very, very well. After all, they're very experienced after conquering the rest of Europe. Meanwhile, the Stavka, so the Soviet high command at the start of the war, is being micromanaged by Stalin. He's sitting there going, no, this person needs to go here, this person needs to go there, you need to do this, you need to do that. And it's a couple of months into it before Georgy Zhukov, the best Soviet general, basically just has enough, and he throws his pencils down on the map, and he's basically telling Stalin, like, get the fuck out of this room and let us do our job. And no one would ever do that to Hitler, right? And Stalin agrees. He goes, actually, you know what? You guys are the experts. I should be trusting your opinions. And he does. He takes a step out of the room and lets his generals take over. And the Soviet leadership in the war starts to improve dramatically. Again, Stalin admits his mistakes and defers to the people who actually have experience and expertise in this area, and they start doing a lot better as a result. Meanwhile, the Germans start doing the opposite. As the war starts getting worse for them, Hitler starts firing his generals left, right, and center, and starts to take control of the war and starts to micromanage it himself, and everything starts turning to shit. And I think that's a great example of how the Soviets actually learned from their mistakes, and the fascists just entrenched themselves into them. Anyway, after the Second World War, Stalin and the Soviet Union are often accused of empire building because they take over all of the Eastern European countries at the end of the war. But again, you can only make that argument without context. You have to remember that everyone's frame of mind in the Soviet Union in 1945 is very, very different to the frame of mind they had in 1938. Since the biggest war in human history was just fought on their land, the idea of creating like a buffer zone or a protection area between the socialist states and the capitalist states, again, there's nothing like having 20 million of your own citizens killed in a massive invasion and war to make you take national security very, very seriously. And there has never been lower trust between the communist states, between the Comintern and the Western Allies as there is in 1945. That Cold War sets in very hard. And it sets in for good reason. I mean, the capitalist countries have always been attacking the Soviet Union, either through direct propaganda or funding rebellions. Remember, the entire Civil War was Western funded in Russia. World War II was the fascists, which were funded by the capitalists to destroy socialism. All of this means that there is very little trust between socialist countries and capitalist countries, not to mention the end of the Second World War sees the two biggest armies that have ever been fielded facing each other, like the Western Allies, and mainly America, which will soon become NATO, have a huge army in the field after they've defeated the Germans, and it's just sitting there on the border between them and the Soviet Union. And on the other side is the biggest army that has ever been fielded. The Red Army is enormous by the end of the Second World War, and it spent the last 4 years fighting the previous best army in the world, which was the Wehrmacht. So the Red Army is not only the biggest army in the world, it is through blood and experience also the best army in the world. Probably the best army the world has ever seen, if we're being honest. And so the need for national security is very important. Also important to remember that both the United States and the Soviet Union were both dragged into the Second World War as a result of surprise attacks. The Americans, of course, get dragged into it from Pearl Harbor, and the Soviet Union got dragged into it from Operation Barbarossa. So neither of them is willing to trust anyone that has an army on their border. The whole logic and strategy for the Soviet Union taking over and absorbing and staying in all of the countries to their western border, so everywhere from Hungary, Poland, East Germany, Austria, Yugoslavia, these are not places the Red Army ever plans to leave, and it's not because of empire building. They're staying there to make sure that there is a really, really big buffer full of their armies between the capitalist countries and the Soviet Union itself. But there's also a lot of opportunism here, because remember that although Stalin was very much about building up socialism in one country first, so building up the Soviet Union before sending revolution to other countries, whereas the Trotskyists just wanted to get straight to that, right? But nonetheless, a bit of opportunism here. I mean, the Red Army now controls all of these countries. Why not install the socialist governments right away? We can negate their need to even have revolutions. We can just impose socialist governments onto these countries right now and free the working class from above, which is what they do. But that looks very different, of course. If you're looking at it through the Western eyes, these aren't spontaneous revolutions from the people going, we want socialism, let's uprise and take over, because they didn't need to. The Soviet Union had already come through and destroyed those bourgeoisie governments and replaced them with these socialist ones. There was no need for the revolution. But without the revolution, it does, from the Western point of view, take a lot of the legitimacy away from these governments. Again, you can point to what these governments start doing after they take power. This is not empire building because they immediately start implementing all the great socialist policies. They start massive literacy programs. They start electrifying towns. They start building hospitals and universal healthcare. They start building houses for everyone. This is not things that, capitalist or fascist dictatorships do. They just go in and extract and exploit. Go ask Poland what it was like living under a fascist government. But look at what happens to Romania and Hungary and Yugoslavia in just the 10 years after the Second World War. Their standard of living explodes. There is nothing before or since that has matched the general improvement of lives of so many people between 1945 and 1955 region will ever see. And all of that is, of course, part of Stalin's policies. To say that he's this dictator who just went to take over and build an empire is to ignore all the things they actually did when they had control of these countries. And it was always about improving the living standards and the power of the working class in all of these countries. That's exactly what they do. At the same time, Stalin's plan, which is now vindicated by everything that has happened in the Second World War, is just to double down on what they've been doing. They're going to keep centralizing power to make sure that everything is being run efficiently, and they're going to double down on the massive industrialization of the entire Comintern. So all of these countries that they have just taken, they are going to build them up and make them extremely strong, just like the Soviet Union. And again, the logic behind this is that the threat from the capitalist countries is still there. If anything, it's bigger because now that NATO is being formed around this same time, and NATO is specifically an anti-communist military alliance. And again, the Soviets just went through this with the fucking Axis. The Axis were exactly the same thing. The anti-Comintern alliance. You had fascist Italy and fascist Germany and fascist Romania and fascist Hungary, and all of them had a military alliance to destroy the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union already knows how this story goes. So the mere existence of NATO for them is enough justification that they're going to do the same thing. They're going to build all of their countries up, all these countries that they have just taken control over. They're going to build them up. They're going to make them really strong, and they're going to replicate that recipe for success that let the Soviet Union survive the Second World War so that they can survive the impending Third World War. Stalin will die not long after this, and I think it's one of the biggest shames that his story ends so early because, again, like Lenin, if Lenin had actually seen his plans go to fruition and to completion, I reckon we'd have a very, very different view of him today. And I think Stalin would also be seen in a very different light if his plans had been finalized, because both Lenin and Stalin were very pro-democratic. Their logic behind having very authoritarian central command was that this is about survival. As long as these capitalist empires exist, they're going to keep attacking and trying to destroy the Soviet Union, which, again, I think we have enough evidence here to prove that that is extremely true and correct. And their logic is we only need the authoritarianism until we have set up our position to be strong enough and stable enough that those capitalist countries can't take us down ever again. And then we can loosen the reins on the authoritarianism and eventually go into communism, a totally stateless society. Both Lenin and Stalin strongly believed in that, and both Lenin and Stalin would die before they ever got to that point. So when Stalin dies in 1953, you're at this high watermark of authoritarianism, but you haven't broken through to the next stage, which again, were right positions to take, but he dies before that can move into its next stage where so Stalin will always go down in Western history, especially as just being this dictator who wanted to rule his people, which is pretty unfair in my opinion. One of the things I often think about when looking at the history of socialist countries is every one of these countries spends their entire existence just fighting for survival. They're all fighting off capitalist imperialism for their entire existence. Cuba is a great example of that. They've been under blockade since the 50s. North Korea as well has basically not been able to start really developing their country until this century because they spent basically all of it building up their military to defend themselves against the United States if they ever were to come back. Remember, in the Korean War, the United States killed like 10% of the Korean population and bombed every single city to ruins in North Korea. That is a memory that has never left the North Korean mind, and their priority has always been survival. But there's no bigger lesson in any of this than the Soviet Union itself. From the moment the revolution happened in 1917, the Soviet Union has had to fight for its survival against Western capitalism, which has always looked for every opportunity to undermine, overthrow, coup, or literally wage the biggest war in human history to try and destroy it. You know, it's one thing to go into a revolution in the first couple of years with this energy, but after decades of it, it wears you down. And even the most staunch revolutionary can start losing enthusiasm for a revolution if you have known nothing but this constant war and threat from the West. It's exhausting. And I think when Stalin dies, this is when you first start to see that exhaustion take its toll. And for the first time in the Soviets' history, it starts to hit a plateau. It has been nothing but 100% energy and speed the entire time from 1917 up to 1950. They've been turning everything up to 11 the whole time, but now they're starting to get tired. I often think about what the Soviet Union would be like if Lenin had lived beyond 1924, and if he hadn't spent that entire existence just trying to survive the Western backlash to the revolution. I think Lenin would have achieved very amazing things. I mean, he did achieve amazing things, but probably things beyond even our imagination. The same for Stalin. If Stalin hadn't spent his entire career under the ghost of impending capitalist imperialist invasion and, of course, the entire fascism era, and can't say this enough, the biggest war in human history. If Stalin had been able to go his entire career without any of those threats, what would the Soviet Union have turned into? I mean, under Stalin's era, they went from illiterate dirt farm, czarist feudal Russia into the biggest superpower in the world, the victor of the Second World War. Everyone can read and write, everyone has a home, everyone is educated, everyone has healthcare. Oh, and they invent fucking space travel. So that's a pretty impressive achievement, especially when you spend half of it rebuilding from devastating wars and constantly being threatened by invasion and attack from the capitalist West. So I wonder what the Soviet Union would have looked like if Stalin had a chance to run the Soviet Union without any of those threats. Nonetheless, we will never know. But for the first time now in Soviet history, a leader comes to the stage who isn't super impressive. It's Nikita Khrushchev. Now, to his credit, he's a formidable person, to be fair. He was there in the early years of the Soviet Union. He was there through the entire Second World War. He is a formidable person in his own right. But he isn't Lenin and he isn't Stalin. And at this point of the Soviets' history, as I mentioned, everyone's starting to get pretty exhausted, and the enthusiasm for international revolution, everything is just starting to crack, and Khrushchev definitely feels the pressure. Stalin was very good at herding cats, if you will. One of the big advantages of his centralized and ruthless leadership was that he was able to keep the various factions in the Soviet Union in line and keep them aimed at the common goal of stabilizing and building up socialism in one country, and then eventually will spread the revolution to the rest of the world. The people in the post-Second World War Soviet Union don't have enthusiasm for any of that. They just want lives without drama for a few years. That's really all anyone wants at this point. And Khrushchev doesn't have the leadership skills to overcome that obstacle, and he just caves into it. And by weakening a lot of the central power, he allows a lot of the factions to start getting their own power. And this is one of the first things that will be the undoing of the Soviet Union. Our central question for this podcast is, if the Soviet Union is so amazing, then how does it fall apart? This is where the first thread starts being pulled at. And Khrushchev has a legitimacy problem right off the bat, because as these factions start to come emboldened now that Stalin is gone, Khrushchev needs to find a way to prove that he is the top dog and that his faction is the strongest and he is rightfully the leader of the Soviet Union. The way he chooses to do that is to throw Stalin under the bus. And he will start releasing all of these papers condemning Stalin and saying Stalin did all these horrible things, and I'm not Stalin, I'm much nicer, I'm much more for the people. This is about consolidating his own power, but in doing so, he is undermining a lot of the accomplishments they made by painting Stalin as this big bad guy, which of course Khrushchev does. And although that does consolidate Khrushchev's own position, it does undermine the Soviet Union itself, and this will have consequences that are going to be paid for big time in the years to come. Now, in defense of Khrushchev, I don't think he understood how much damage he was doing when he did undermine Stalin and threw all of those accomplishments under the bus to put his faction and himself into power. I think he was doing it for good intention reasons, because Khrushchev inherits the leadership in a particularly rough era for the Soviet Union. I mean, there's never been a good era for the Soviet Union. There's always some existential crisis on the horizon at all times. And at this point, it's the Cold War, the idea that World War III could break out at any moment, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which changes everything yet again. But one thing that Khrushchev does get right, like his predecessors, Lenin and Stalin, who are both pragmatists, well, so is Khrushchev. He looks at all of these crises everywhere and all of these problems, and he's still rebuilding the country after the Second World War on top of all of this. He is a pragmatist, and he looks for ways to further the socialist agenda within the limitations that he has on him. And one of the things that Khrushchev will definitely get right is he is very passionate about anti-colonialism and aligning what is now called the Third World to come within the Soviet and communist sphere of influence. It's actually worth just going over that terminology for a moment, because this is where it really emerges. You know, the whole First, Second, and Third World. It's a Western invention, by the way, and it's a way of undermining the Soviet Union. So the First World is the capitalist countries. It's the Western capitalist countries led by NATO and the United States. They position themselves and call themselves the First World. You know, we're the right world. We're the top dogs. We're the best you can possibly be. That's the meaning of phrasing yourself as the First World. The Second World is the Soviet bloc, and by this point, the Warsaw Pact has come into practice. So when NATO is formed, which is all the Western European countries forming an anti-communist military alliance together against the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union say, well, two can play at that game, and all of the countries that are now within their sphere of influence, which is, you know, the new socialist republics of Hungary and Romania and Poland and Yugoslavia and so on, they form their own military pact called the Warsaw Pact. And all of them together, the socialist and communist countries, they're called the Second World. The Third World, on the surface, this is the countries that are unaligned. But in reality, it's basically all of the colonies around the world that haven't been decolonized yet. So basically, all of Africa, a lot of South America, a lot of Asia. These are places that are still controlled either directly by colonial military forces, like by this point, Vietnam is still a French colony, Algeria is still a French colony, India is still an English colony, Malaysia is still an English colony, so on and so on. And these are the countries that both the first and second world are going to ideologically fight over. And this is something that Khrushchev is particularly passionate about. And he is a strong advocate for decolonization and the national liberation movements. And he will spend a lot of time and money and energy offering diplomatic and economic and military aid to any colonial country trying to break away from their capitalist colonial overlords. So the Soviet Union under Khrushchev's leadership will be all over places like Egypt, Algeria, Vietnam, Ghana, Kenya, in Indonesia, India, Malaysia. You can often go find videos and photos from the liberation wars in all of these countries, and you will note a lot of the guerrillas are carrying Soviet weapons. That's not a coincidence. Khrushchev is the one who sent them to them. The biggest win Khrushchev will probably have is in 1956 when the Suez Crisis happens and Egypt breaks away from being part of the British Empire. And Khrushchev will have a big hand in that, supporting the Egyptian forces and also just providing a lot of diplomatic legitimacy to Colonel Nasser's government by acknowledging that they are the legitimate government. And the Soviet Union, of course, is a very big and powerful country. And if they say, I recognize your government as legitimate, that carries a lot of weight. And so that's one of the things that Khrushchev will definitely do right. The threat of World War III and nuclear war is, of course, on everyone's mind. I mean, often we hear about that portrayed from the Western perspective, but it's just as true from the Soviet perspective. Khrushchev recognizes that this is probably not the best time to push and demand huge amounts from his people. So he tempers his expectations and his goals for the Soviet Union. He will still do some really cool stuff. They will basically expand all of the schools, especially the technical universities, to just really upskill everyone, not just proficient literacy and numeracy, but giving them the higher skills. So a lot of university expansions, a lot of technical skill expansions. He will also massively increase the housing. Again, all of those big drab Soviet brutalist apartments that are everywhere. He will be one of the biggest architects of those, and they will be built everywhere, because by this point, yes, everyone is housed, but there's also kind of overcrowding. These apartments that they slapped up really quick to solve the housing problem are not super comfortable. They're overcrowded. Amenities have to be shared by a lot of people. So there is a big initiative from Khrushchev to just build more apartments, a bit more spacious apartments, and just improve that quality of living. He will also expand welfare, so there'll be big pension expansion under his reign, better benefits for workers and retirees, as well as an expansion of the childcare programs throughout the Soviet Union. There'll also be big work time reforms under Khrushchev to reduce the amount of working hours for the average worker. He will also work to improve the minimum wage throughout the Soviet Union, just generally improving the cost of living and the quality of life for the majority of people within the Soviet Union. But these aren't massive initiatives. They're just kind of improvements on the foundation that, Stalin had already created. But the side effect of having this attitude is, again, a lot of people's enthusiasm is starting to drop. And when you get people into a rhythm of enjoying life, which is what Khrushchev is doing here, it's very hard to motivate them again, to pull them out of that to start wanting to achieve a lot more in the future. And this will be a really big problem for the Soviet Union over the next few decades, because a certain level of complacency starts to set in amongst the whole Soviet Union. And this is the early 1950s. This is the end of the Second World War. This is rebuilding. This is the downtime after the biggest catastrophic event in human history. But the problem is, once you let people rest, It's very hard to get them enthusiastic again about spreading revolution across the world, especially if the price of that could be World War III. And the Soviets know better than anyone how bad the price of the Second World War was. And this will lead to an era of stagnation in terms of just about everything. The enthusiasm in the workplaces starts to drop. The enthusiasm for revolution starts to drop. It's a very hard problem to overcome. And Khrushchev is not the man to overcome it. So to recap, the two biggest problems that are coming out of the Soviet Union at this point is there is now much, much weaker central command. The Central Committee does not have the power, authority, or the aura of Stalin. And it's allowing little factions to start revealing themselves within the politics of the Soviet Union. And this is being coupled with the exhaustion and complacency that is also starting to infect every single industry. These two things combined initially aren't a huge problem, but unaddressed, they will grow into a much, much bigger problem for the Soviet Union soon. Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership do recognize both of these issues as potentially being big problems. They're not fools on this. They just see it as like, this is something we can kick down the road for a while without too much consequence. But they do decide to do something about it, and this is one of the main motivations behind the Soviet space program. This was a way of showcasing the accomplishments of the Soviet Union and the efficiency of the Soviet Union and the amazing things they are aiming for, because it's such a big culture win to not only invent space travel, but lead all of the research in that area, because it's the most high-tech thing you can possibly do. And it's showing the world, especially the third world, the amazing accomplishments and the amazing power of socialism. If you're in the West, you often see the space race as being like won by America because they were the first people to land someone on the moon. But that's entirely a Western metric. The fact that America got the first person on the moon only happened because all of the amazing advancements the Soviets had already done, like the 15 years leading up to it. Like the Soviets are the first to launch any object into space. They are the innovators in a lot of the rocket technology that will be used for space travel. Incidentally, the reason the Soviets are so good at rockets in general is because they loved using them in the Second World War. More than any other nation, the Soviets loved the use of rocket artillery. The infamous Katyusha rocket launchers were everywhere. They loved rockets, and they were very innovative about rockets, and they turned those rockets to the civilian space program after the war. I just think that's a funny little anecdote. Anyway, so not only does the Soviet Union launch the first rocket into space in 1955, they launched the first satellite in the world, Sputnik, and then they launched Sputnik 2 as well. They also are the first people to land an object on the moon. Even though the Americans will be the first to put a person on the moon, they weren't the first people to the moon. The Russians will launch 3 lunar missions before that. In 1959, they'll launch Luna 1, which is the first capsule to go around the moon. Luna 2 is the first time a man-made object lands on the moon. And Luna 3 is the first mission that will take pictures of the far side of the moon. So these are all things the Soviet Union accomplished long before NASA was able to put a person on the moon. The Soviets are also the first to put a person into space, Yuri Gagarin. They're also the first people to put a woman into space, Valentina Tereshkova. The first spacewalk in 1965, when Alexei Leonov is the first person to leave a vehicle in space and return to it. These are all huge innovations that the Soviet Union designed, created, and executed long before NASA was really had anything going. So important to point that out, I think. The Soviet Union will also be the first to launch a space station in 1971. They will be the first to send an object to Mars as well. So massive accomplishments from the Soviet Union in regards to space travel. And although the Soviet space program is a big culture and diplomatic win for the Soviet Union in its early years, the dream turns to horror as both NASA and the Soviet Union are developing all of these rockets, and it doesn't take long before those rockets get turned to military use. And in this case, they create the most fearsome and horrifying weapon humanity has ever created, which is ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they, of course, carry nuclear warheads. At this point, the hydrogen bomb has also been invented, and they are the most destructive weapons humanity has ever created. And they are starting to proliferate everywhere in both the Soviet Union and the United States. And the space race takes on a whole other flavor because of that. And these rockets, which were supposed to be a sign of peace and prosperity and accomplishment and civilization and all of these great things, turns to become like the Grim Reaper. It is this fear hanging over all of humanity that what if these rockets get unleashed on all the countries and it is global thermonuclear war, total complete Armageddon. And that fear reaches its high watermark in 1963. So after the Cuban Revolution, the United States, of course, immediately blockades Cuba to try and strangle the island and overthrow the government. Get the people to rise up and overthrow their own government so that the US and corporations can come back in and reclaim control of Cuba. And in 1961, so a couple of years after the revolution, the US comes up with this idea of getting all of the Cuban exiles in Florida, giving them guns and support by the CIA and air support from the US Navy, and they can go and invade Cuba, overthrow the communist government, and reinstate US control over the island. The Bay of Pigs invasion, as it's known, is an absolute disaster. And the Americans massively underestimate how much support the communist government in Cuba has, as pretty much the entire island comes out to defend against this invasion. And they basically arrest all of the people who try to invade Cuba. It's an absolute disaster. From the Soviet Union's point of view, this is a really good battleground for their ideological fight. Remember, this is all about winning over the alignment of the Third World. And Cuba is clearly already aligned with the Soviet Union. They've gone full communist and they're Marxist-Leninist too. So they are exactly aligned with the Soviet Union and everything that matters. So the Soviet Union lends a lot of support to the Cuban Revolution. They start flooding the island with guns and ammo and Soviet instructors and military advisors and, oh yeah, nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union starts deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba that can easily reach the US mainland. Now, again, from the Western point of view, this is framed as like this massive escalation and a huge act of aggression. But I would like to remind you that at this exact same point, 1962, the United States has already surrounded the Soviet Union with nuclear missile sites everywhere. Turkey, which is Russia's neighbor, is full of US strategic missiles. So is France, so is Germany. They're everywhere. Like the Soviet Union is entirely in range of US nuclear missiles. So all this is really doing by the Soviet Union putting missiles in Cuba is leveling the playing field. But for the US, this is a uncrossable line. And this will be a really big moment in Soviet history because it will really test their resolve. This will spiral into what's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States says we will not tolerate nuclear missiles in range of the US mainland. And the Soviets are sitting there going, well, why not? We have to tolerate your missiles in range of our homeland. This is where this becomes this really big ideological battle, because how far are both of these sides willing to go to push their point? The Soviet Union is saying we absolutely have a right to deploy missiles within allied countries, just as the United States is allowed to do it to theirs. The US is saying we will wipe Cuba off the map before we allow you to have nuclear missiles on that island. And this is really the big fundamental difference, the big ideological difference between communism and capitalism. Because the capitalists absolutely mean that. They are willing to kill every single person in Cuba if that's what it takes to get rid of those missiles. But the Soviet Union is not willing to sacrifice all of those people just to win an ideological point. That is actually completely against the ideological beliefs of communism. This is about the people. and they are not willing to sacrifice the lives of every Cuban person just to prove a point. So the USSR, the Soviet Union, will be the ones that back down in the end. This is again framed as this huge win for the West, but you really should look at it from the Soviet point of view, because they understood that the US was absolutely willing to kill millions of people to push their agenda, but the Soviet Union is not. And that is the starkest example of who the good guy and who the bad guy is. And I feel this view is only further reinforced by the fact that this is the same year that the Vietnam War will really kick off, with America involved in it. And America will kill millions of people in Vietnam. Not just Vietnam. In Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they will bomb the shit out of tons of cities. Just try and win that war. They will kill millions of people. In the Korean War, they did the same thing. They completely obliterated North Korea with their bombers to try and win that war. And this is something you never see the Soviet Union do. The Soviet Union will only fight a couple of wars in its entire existence, and never does it mass bomb city centers, ever. That is something only the United States and capitalist countries do. Nonetheless, in terms of the diplomatic and geopolitical situation here, the Soviet Union loses, and that is something they don't really ever recover from. This is a huge blow to Khrushchev, especially. It's a realization for all the hardened revolutionaries, even within the Soviet Union, that the cost of fighting imperialism and fighting for decolonization will very likely escalate into nuclear war with the United States, because the United States are fanatically capitalist and nothing matters to them but profit, and they are absolutely willing to wipe out tens of millions of people to ensure that profit keeps flowing. And that is something the Soviet Union is not willing to match the US in terms of its aggressiveness with. It slams the brakes on a lot of the decolonization work that the Soviet Union is doing, and you will see their enthusiasm starting to weaken in lots of wars. The Soviet Union will go to great lengths to publicly say they are not involved in the Vietnam War. They are, of course. The Soviet Union will give a ton of material support and even straight up military forces to Vietnam, but they will go to painstaking lengths to not implicate themselves publicly in that. I mean, everyone knows that the Russians are all over Vietnam. I mean, the North Vietnamese army has the state-of-the-art radar-locking anti-air missiles that are just absolutely destroying US fighter jets. I mean, there are advanced Russian fighter jets themselves, like the MiG-21, that is just dominating the skies over Vietnam at one point in the war. That's clearly all coming from Russia, but they will slap the Vietnamese flag on it. And even when there's Russian pilots there, they'll all carry, completely forged Vietnamese passports. These guys don't look Vietnamese at all, but the point is the diplomatic cover. It doesn't fool anyone, but it's enough that the US can also turn a blind eye and go, no, these are just Vietnam pilots. We're not at war with the Soviet Union, because that's not in anyone's interest. But nonetheless, the Cuban Missile Crisis will be a huge hit to the decolonization efforts and the enthusiasm for international revolution as a result of being made abundantly clear that the United States is willing to go to nuclear war to stop it. And the loss of enthusiasm for international revolution and decolonization, again, that on its own isn't enough to fully undermine faith in the Soviet Union, but it's just one extra little scratch, right? Like when you compile it with all the other issues that are starting to build here, the decentralized power is starting to weaken, all of the industries are starting to plateau, the exhaustion and endless threat from this war, not to mention the massive amount of time, money, and energy the Soviet Union has to spend building this massive military to compete with the United States. And now the fact that even international revolution itself comes with potentially existential danger, the enthusiasm for socialism is starting to wane a bit. Within the Soviet Union, of course, like internationally, it's also still blowing up. Like Vietnam is huge into this at this point. North Korea is also going strong at this point. Cuba as well. They're all new there. And everywhere in Africa, there are massive Marxist-Leninist movements all over the continent, fighting their own decolonial battles. But the Soviet Union itself is starting to get tired, and it's starting to show, and it's starting to seep into all sorts of facets of the society. And it's just going to add one more straw to the camel's back. But yes, it's important to mention, I can't believe I haven't mentioned it up to this point, that the Soviet Union is spending far more money on their military than they ever hoped they would have to. And it's another one of those exhaustion points, right? Like they've spent pretty much every minute from 1917 building up this big military, which initially is just there to stop the capitalists from invading their country. And this is something that Marxist-Leninists specifically understand, and one of the reasons why the only successful communist revolutions are always Marxist-Leninists is because they prioritize that central command and building up that massive military, because they know that capitalist imperialism is going to come and crush them. And this is, of course, a lesson the Soviet Union itself would learn in its civil war, and then in the Great Patriotic War. It's the lesson that Cuba learnt the moment their revolution was launched, and still to this day they have to endure the US blockade and the US trying to destroy their government. Vietnam learnt this lesson in the 40s because they had to fight off numerous capitalist imperialistic powers from their land. Originally they fought off the French, then the Japanese invaded, they kicked the Japanese out, then the French came back and they kicked them out, then the Americans came and they had to kick them out, and Vietnam spent 30 years fighting for their survival, and they would not have survived without Marxist-Leninism. If you look at all of the successful revolutions in Africa as well, like Burkina Faso, they were Marxist-Leninists as well. But the point being that from the moment the Soviet Union was founded, they've had to fight for their right to survive. And by this point, they're nearly 4 decades deep into that, and that has never stopped being true. The US, for its part, founded NATO. All of Western Europe is allied into this massive anti-Soviet military alliance, which the Soviets are very dubious of, because remember the last time they had a giant anti-communist military alliance on their border, which was led by Germany and the Axis, the biggest war in human history was fought. The Soviets are convinced that World War III is not far away, and it'll be NATO that launches it. They are going to attack them and try to destroy them. They need to be ready for that. And the US, rather than fielding large armies, all over the world, although the US military is very big, but they don't have like a huge standing army just sitting in Europe. They outsource that work like good capitalists to all of the European countries themselves. All America does is give them the weapons. The US military industrial complex, which is what pretty much the entire US economy is going to be built on from like the end of the Second World War onwards, is just there to make sure that they can sell weapons to as many friendly countries as they can, to as many capitalist countries as they can. And Vietnam will teach them that you don't even necessarily have to win a war. Just having a war go on forever is really good for business. And the US is just concentrated on constantly designing and building and shipping the newest, most high-tech weapons. The Soviet Union, in turn, can see this and goes, we need to at least be able to compete with the United States in this regard. So the Soviet Union has to put a huge amount of its economy just dedicated to building these weapons and having a military that can match the United States, and that is also an exhausting endeavor. And it's one of the extra straws on the camel's back, because the revolution, was promising an end to all of this. But we're several decades deep now, and although the idea of isolation, building socialism in one country and so on, and building out slowly from that, that was a great way to stabilize. But 4 decades later, and it feels like it's never going to stabilize. And if anything, it's getting worse. Like the idea of World War III is terrifying to everyone, especially the people in the Soviet Union. And, well, it's not great for morale. We'll just put it that way. It's interesting that the Cuban Missile Crisis will be the end of the political careers of both President Kennedy and the US, who will be killed not long after that. And it'll be the end of Khrushchev's career as well. There's a loss of faith in Khrushchev's leadership by the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And all of these problems that are starting to build, is becoming of great concern for the Central Committee, which is actually called the Council of Ministers of the USSR. That's its actual name, but I just call it the Central Committee because it's easier. The Central Committee is getting very concerned about these problems, and they decide it's time for a change of leadership. We need some fresh blood in here and some much, much better eyebrows. And in 1964, Leonid Brezhnev will be promoted to the General Secretary of the party. And Brezhnev and his eyebrows have their work cut out for them. The Soviet Union is not in a great state in the 1970s. The biggest problem is the stagnation that has now become structural. Now, if you recall, Khrushchev was willing to basically relax a lot of the goals and incentives. Khrushchev decided to give people a break after everything they have been through. And we knew at the time that if this went on for more than a little while, it would become structural, and now it has. In the 1970s, the Soviet economy is stagnating. There is no enthusiasm for anything anywhere because everyone has hit this level of just general comfort, and the need to keep building, to push these 5-year plans, these really ambitious 5-year plans, is very hard to get people motivated. If Stalin was still around, he would get people motivated, but Khrushchev was not Stalin, and Brezhnev is not Stalin. Brezhnev is resigned to just doing whatever little changes he can here and there. Again, kind of like Khrushchev, but it's nowhere near enough. And, in a capitalist country, that's not a big deal. The corporations are running everything anyway, for better or for worse, almost always worse. But nonetheless, they're going to get shit done. But in a planned economy, you really need that central authority pushing those targets for the people, or they're just not going to do it because the incentive is just not there. The people are going to be paid the same amount whether they go above and beyond their required duties or not. And everything about this system now has fallen into this very lethargic bureaucracy. For example, a lot of metrics for success are just measuring produce by tons rather than by its value, which basically means, you get a bunch of farmers or factory workers that just produce literally heavier stuff just because it's being measured in tons, right? Not by the value. And so there's a lot of corners being cut everywhere. And at the same time, a lot of innovation has been stifled because the way this bureaucracy is set up, there's no real reward for taking any risks, but it can ruin your career if you mess up what you've already been assigned to. So you've got a whole bunch of middle managers around the country that don't want to take any risks of any kind because the consequences of getting it wrong is to lose your job. So they are very, very comfortable just doing the bare minimum everywhere. And again, this has now become a structural thing. And it's not something you saw under Stalin. Stalin was very, very good at motivating people and getting them to do their absolute best. You don't see that in the 1970s Soviet Union. The other reason this stagnation has set in, and this is a problem I think you'll find every single socialist government eventually comes up against. It's a big problem that Cuba had to deal with a few years back, which is the first generation to launch a revolution is all about enthusiasm because they come from the old world. They remember how bad it was, and they are super motivated to make a better life for themselves and for their children. For example, the people who led the revolution against the Tsar were serfs, illiterate serfs before then, heavily oppressed. They had nothing. And then when they launched the revolution, you had all these people that were born in that horrible serf world, and suddenly they've got food and housing, and they're going to university, and they're becoming engineers, and they've got all this opportunities in life that they never would have had under the previous capitalist or under the previous czarist government or whatever form of oppression they came from before. But the problem is that only works on the first generation, because all the kids who are born after the revolution, they are born into this better world and they take it for granted. For them, this is just how the life is. You have a house, you have healthcare, you have education. This is just what life is. And they lose a lot of the appreciation of everything that already exists. And so by 1970s Soviet Union, you've got nearly 2 generations of people that have their baseline life at very high quality, and they have no appreciation for all the blood that was needed to earn it. And this creates a, well, I guess the only way to put it is a very selfish world outlook. For them, it's about, how do I improve from this already good baseline I have? I want a better life, and that's a human view, right? I would argue you saw the exact same attitude come out of the boomer generation in the West. Especially here in Australia, you had people who grew up in the 70s who reaped the benefits of all the socialist policies that Australia had before their time. They got free education, houses were cheap and plentiful, there were jobs everywhere. It was still a capitalist country, but there were a lot of socialist policies that made life better. But they were born into it and took it for granted. They didn't see the blood that was earned for it. The people born in the 30s and the 40s had a lot more appreciation for those policies because they had to grow up in the Great Depression and saw how much worse it can get. But the boomers in Australia didn't have that problem. And in 1970s Soviet Union, you have the exact same problem. They have no appreciation for all that came before it. And again, I mentioned Cuba as well. This was a problem. Michael Parenti pointed this out, actually, Black Shirts in Reds, where you have a whole generation of like younger Cubans who grew up after the revolution, and all they want is to become like real estate agents. So they want to move to the West so they can get a better quality of life without appreciating all of the foundations that have allowed them to have a healthy, well-educated life up to that point. Nonetheless, this is a problem, and the Soviet Union needs to figure out a solution to it quick. Because on the other side of Europe, the US is running their own great propaganda campaign wherever there's a border area between the West and the East. So, between NATO and Warsaw, they put all the richest people on the border. So all the flashy cars, all the jewelry shops, all the best fashion, all the rock music, all the concerts, all of that, they always do it on the border because they want everyone on the other side to see all this extravagance from the West, and they're going to go, my God, look how much better they have it over there. But the people in the Soviet Union aren't talking to those people, and they don't understand that the people in the West don't have universal healthcare, they don't have universal housing, they don't have universal education. They got a lot of glitz and glamour. And when you're living in the Soviet Union and you have all those baseline things and you're looking over at the West at all the glitz and the glamour, you're thinking, I want everything that I currently have under socialism, but I also want all of that glitz and glamour in the West. And it's a very, very effective propaganda campaign from the US and the capitalist countries because it tricks a lot of people in the Soviet Union into thinking the West is a much better way of life. In the years just after the revolution in the Soviet Union, it is clear to see between like the 1930s and the 1950s that the Soviet Union is absolutely the tech innovator of the world. They are producing some of the most amazing technology the world has ever seen. One of the reasons they are able to beat the Nazis, for example, is the innovation that came out of the revolution, like having all of these serfs and giving them engineering degrees and basically saying, you can all go and design what you want. Whoever has the best design, that's what we're going to put into production. That led a whole generation of particularly Soviet military innovations. Things like the T-34 tank, which was one of the best in the world. There's a whole bunch of really, really good Soviet weapons and planes and everything that they make. The IL-2 Sturmovik, another amazing innovation in terms of warfare anyway. They were leading the world in terms of innovation. They had the rockets as well. They had computing, the space travel. But all of that needed that central leadership from Stalin to push those initiatives. By the time the decentralization has really set into the Soviet Union in the 1970s, the innovation has also fallen flat with it. And as a consequence, the West has caught up. The US overtakes the Soviet Union by this point in terms of technological innovations. And that puts a further strain and disillusionment on the people within the Soviet Union. And it's something that they really, really struggle to find a solution to. Again, the only way you could really fix that is to tighten the reins and get that central power back up and the authoritarianism to push people into these areas. But there is no enthusiasm from that coming from the Central Committee, because the other byproduct of having all the stagnation for a while is the corruption. A lot of people are very comfortable with their political positions and don't want to do anything to rock the boat. They don't have dreams beyond finding ways to get side hustles out of the little areas they look after and enriching themselves. And this is the biggest emerging problem. I have often called corruption the biggest threat a government can ever face, because corruption can destabilize everything. You can look at the fall of every single empire in all of history, and you can pinpoint the moment they go into decline is when corruption completely takes over. The greatest modern example is what has happened to America now. You can pinpoint the exact moment the corruption completely takes over their government, which is just after 9/11, 2001, when they launched the war on terror and unleashed the Patriot Act. And they go and destroy Iraq and Afghanistan, and all of these private companies owned by the vice president gets to go in and, I'm using big air quotes here, rebuild the countries. That is a huge conflict of interest and an obvious sign of corruption. But what really happened during the war on terror was a heist, because all government accountability was swept away under the name of national security. And in that darkness, trillions of dollars just disappeared. The Pentagon has failed every single audit since then, because they're basically saying, we need all this money for national defense. But there's no receipts. No one knows where that money's going. And at the same time, you've got all these defense contractors and billionaires who are getting extremely rich from these endless wars. And all of that money just disappears into private hands. It was a heist. And no one was ever held accountable for that. When the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan wound down, there were a ton of politicians that should have gone on trial for corruption. Because there were no trials, because there were no consequences for that corruption has now become ingrained in the entire US government, and the corruption has overtaken everything. And that's how you get someone like Trump in power. He and all the politicians in US now have learnt that all you do as a politician is corruption. It's all insider trading. It's all making yourself as rich as you can, because there are no consequences to doing it. No consequences now. But the consequences for it is what you're seeing happening to America now. The entire government is hollowed out. It doesn't do anything for the people. It is just making themselves and all of their accomplices as rich as they possibly can. And that's why America is on the brink of collapsing itself. Regardless of what happens with any of the wars, the fact that their entire government is just unfettered corruption at this point means the whole thing is going to break and collapse soon. Anyway, the Soviet Union wasn't that bad, but it had corruption. And when there's corruption, when you let it sit in, it is very, very hard to get out. Because the more powerful people you have as an accomplice in your corruption, they have to protect themselves too, right? So they're not going to lead any anti-corruption measures, because they would get implicated as well. And if you just keep bribing a few more politicians and a few more officials and a few more people on board, well, soon you've corrupted the entire system, and no one is ever going to do anything about it, and the system was never going to work again. And several layers of that happened to the Soviet Union in the 1970s. So now you've got all of these compounding problems, all the problems we've already mentioned, and on top of that, you've got this corruption that is now going to stop any of the solutions from coming forward. And I think it's at this point when the clock starts ticking for the Soviet Union. It is now terminally ill, and unless something is drastically changed right this minute, it is impossible to save the Soviet Union. And unfortunately for the Soviet Union, not only is there not going to be some savior or some change of direction or something that's going to come and stabilize this situation, they actually go the opposite direction. And one of the biggest disasters of Soviet policy is about to happen. Because in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. There is a reason Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. And long-time listeners might remember that it's one of the first episodes we did here on the Triploi podcast. So if you want a exhaustive look at how and why Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, that's a good episode to go check out. But it is fitting that Afghanistan, which in my opinion was the fatal moment for the US empire, they're still living with the consequences of the Afghanistan war to this day, and it will eventually prove to be the terminal wound that ends the US empire. But it's also true that it was the same for the Soviet Union. Afghanistan would actually have a socialist revolution and would have a socialist government in power in the 1970s. But the United States will spend a lot of effort trying to undermine and destroy and coup that government when they fund the Mujahideen, which is a right-wing paramilitary force, which would later become the Taliban. But back then, the Mujahideen are trying to destroy the socialist government in Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan not to overtake it and destroy its government, but to prop up and save its government, the people's government. This was supposed to be a quick, easy diplomatic win for Brezhnev because, this is the Soviet Union moving in and protecting a people and their government. But they underestimate how much effort and how much money the United States is going to spend funding the Mujahideen and waging a long and deadly and hard guerrilla war throughout the country. And it will turn into a nightmare for the Soviet Union, as any invasion of Afghanistan does for anyone who invades them. America would learn that lesson soon enough. Britain had already learnt that lesson by this point. But in 1979 and the early 80s, this will be the Soviets' time to learn. And the war will just go on, and the Soviets will lose a lot of people, a lot of equipment, and it will just drain resources, and it will erode the legitimacy of the Soviet Union, because the longer this goes on and the more people die, the more people start to question, A, is this the right move? And B, if this is really about helping and saving the people of Afghanistan, why on earth is it so costly and so hard for this to progress? This will just be like a multiplier to all of the problems that the Soviet Union currently has, because their stagnating economy, it doesn't have much enthusiasm as it is, and it certainly doesn't have enthusiasm for ramping up production to fight a very unpopular war. And the more bloody and costly this war becomes, the more it undermines the Soviet Union's foreign policy and the rhetoric around it, because the Soviet Union is always at the UN talking about things like, we emphasize peace and anti-imperialism and international solidarity. But this war, and there are cameras everywhere, man, this is the early 80s, and the US propaganda machine is very well refined by this point, and they're basically capturing every dead person and basically saying, this is Soviet imperialism. This is the evil Soviets, the evil Reds. And after decades of anti-communist propaganda in the West, this is one of the easiest propaganda wins they could ever have, by just having actual dead bodies on the ground and Soviet soldiers everywhere. They're able to really undermine the Soviets' image, and it is a PR disaster for the Soviet Union. Ironically, the reason the United States was able to identify this as such an easy win for them is because this is what the Soviet Union did to the United States in Vietnam. Because the US was in Vietnam saying, we're here to help these people, liberate these people, but the US is just leaving bodies everywhere in their wake. They're burning down villages, there are massacres everywhere, they're bombing cities, and the Soviet Union just had to go and take some cameras to Vietnam, go, look at the reality of US capitalist imperialism. They're not here helping anyone. Look at the bodies everywhere. And that was such an easy PR win for the Soviet Union. And the US learned a lot of lessons from that. And they turned it completely on their head when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And they use it as one of the biggest PR wins of anti-communist propaganda of all time. It will also be one of the biggest moments that will drive a rift between the Central Committee of the Soviet Union and all of the countries within the Warsaw Pact. You start seeing the nationalist movements, which have been starting to grow for a while in a lot of places, especially like Hungary and Poland. They start having the flames of nationalism being fanned by the very unpopular nature of this war. And not only was it very unpopular to fight this war for all of these years, the fact that they also lost it is a devastating blow for them. To a lesser extent, the Soviet Union also had to deal with the increases of corruption from the war, which is one of the consequences of war, especially war in Afghanistan. Again, you can point to the moment the US starts to enter its terminal decline as the war in Afghanistan and all the corruption that comes out of it. To a lesser extent, that happens in the Soviet Union, but it does happen. And again, it just entrenches that layer of corruption, which will eventually overtake everything. By the 1980s, it is clear to everyone, especially the Central Committee within the Soviet Union itself, that the Soviet Union is in dire trouble. It is a crisis on nearly every front. All of these problems that have been left to just fester are now starting to become crises. And it is clear that urgent action is needed to save the Soviet Union, which is why one of the worst possible events to derail any action to save the Soviet Union happens right now. Because in 1982, Brezhnev, who has been premier for 12 years, dies suddenly in office. He is succeeded by Andropov, who will die less than 2 years later, who is then succeeded by Chernenko, who will die only a year after that. These sequence of deaths will just shake to the core everyone's faith in the Central Committee, because they just can't get any momentum on any of the changes. And the best chance they probably have of saving the Soviet Union was under Andropov, because his main focus was anti-corruption measures. He saw that the fact that the corruption is starting to seep in everywhere as being an existential threat to the Soviet Union. Like, the Soviet Union will not survive growing corruption. And that's his main focus. And he dies before he can even really get those anti-corruption programs and the discipline campaigns into action. And that just further decays the Central Committee's authority. It decentralizes the power in the country even more. And all of these problems just keep flaming out. And you start seeing a big rise in cynicism as people are starting to believe that there's just no way they're going to fix these problems. And that mentality is both toxic and contagious, and it starts spreading everywhere. And honestly, kind of fair. Like, the Central Committee, it is their responsibility to get this country back on track, and they are failing spectacularly at it. Again, this is not one of those moments where you kind of just wish they could raise Stalin from the dead, because he would sort this out nice and quick. But alas, that is not to be. The United States is also noticing that the Soviet Union is in serious trouble, and it is paying attention to these succession crises and all the other crises that are overtaking the Soviet Union at this point. And the CIA decides to go on the offensive. Throughout Eastern Europe, the CIA will infiltrate a lot of the governments there and fan the flames of nationalism, most famously in Poland. Poland will see the first major protests against the Soviet Union from within the Soviet Union in a very long time. And it creates a really big problem for the central government, because the things that the Polish workers are protesting against are things the Central Committee is supposed to be defending, which creates a very sticky contradiction. For one thing, the uprising and protests in Poland is organizing because they want higher wages and better conditions, and they are becoming disillusioned with Moscow's central control and the fact that they are pursuing things like a war in Afghanistan, which most of the workers in the rest of the Union aren't really on board with. And on the surface, you're like, well, you know what? They got a point. I mean, the Central Committee does seem to be abandoning a lot of the principles laid out by Lenin and Marx in the first place. On one hand, yes, we should probably be listening to the Polish workers. The other half of this protest is very big, specifically because the CIA is helping to fund a lot of it, because they know that any protest anywhere, especially a successful protest, will likely grow and spread to other countries. So they are getting backing from the CIA for that exact reason. But that is not to take away from the legitimate grievance a lot of the Polish workers actually have, because they're right, the Central Committee has been letting them down for a while now. This would have been a great moment for a strong leader in the Soviet Union to stand up and actually address these problems and go, right, let's roll up our sleeves, let's bring back the spirit of Stalin, let's get centralized, let's get authoritarian, let's get shit done, and let's fix and improve the lives of the people within the Union. That was one way they could and should have handled it. Instead, they do basically the worst thing you could possibly do, which is send the military in to intervene. It was the wrong response because the optics are terrible and it's amazing propaganda for the West. The US are loving this and they are spreading those images all over the place. And as a result, these protests will start spreading to neighboring countries. And the Soviet Central Command will do the same response, which is to send in the tanks and the army to quell the protesters. It is devastating for everyone's morale. And again, this is a problem that wouldn't have arisen had they gotten on top of all of the problems set in motion by Khrushchev all those years ago. They just let these problems fester and grow, and now they have exploded into a situation that is going to see the Soviet Union head into terminal decline. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power, and his whole platform is to address all of these issues. His platform is to rescue socialism rather than end it. And I'm a little bit sympathetic to Gorbachev. He's a very contentious character in this story. But I believe his intentions are good, even if the execution is not. Because he's basically inherited an almost impossible situation by this point. All of these problems have compounded, and it is clear that the clock is ticking. There is very little time to fix all of these problems that have just been compounding and compounding and becoming crisis. And he's got two real options open to him. And, in defense of him, no one's really sure which one of these is going to be the right decision. Even when I was researching this, and I already had a pretty clear view of how I felt about what Gorbachev has done. When I was reading the situation as he saw it when he came to power, I have to admit, even I'm sitting here going, well, you know what? That's a really tough decision. Because basically it boils down to this. You've got a whole system that is now bogged down in corruption and concealment to hide that corruption. And you've got this bureaucratic system that is mostly obsessed with self-protection, again, because of the corruption. Everything has stagnated. Everyone's losing faith. The economy is not going well. The standard of living, which was rising for most of the Soviet history, is now starting to decline for the first time. You've got the West that has overtaken the Soviet Union in terms of its technological progress. It's winning the culture war. It's just there are problems absolutely everywhere. And Gorbachev's got two options open to him. He can either adopt straight up Stalinism and just basically take back control of everything in this country under the Central Committee and rule the country with a firm hand to get it back on track. That's option A. Go full authoritarian, get everything back on track, and then ease up down the line. The other school of thought says you should actually start loosening the reins right now. Let's decentralize the power. Let's give people a far more autonomy, give them far more say in how to run things, introduce more democracy at every level of the workplace to basically make people happier. That seems like the obvious choice here, right? Like you should just implement more democracy, let people have more choice, everyone will be happier, everything will get back on track. Except the problem with that is that corruption has really seeped in everywhere. And if you decentralize power, you gain less control to rein in the corruption. And that's going to cause a lot more problems down the line. That said, you've got a whole bunch of countries in the Union, in the alliance, in the Warsaw Pact that are already on the verge of open rebellion. And they are demanding far more democratic freedoms and things like that. So what do you do in this situation? If you ease up On the authoritarianism, you basically open the door to the corruption and the rebellions. But if you stamp down on it all, you're going against the wishes of all your people. It's a real tough situation. My personal view is this is a problem that Stalin identified back in the day. That's why he was so authoritarian. He was get control of the existential threats and defend yourself against the capitalist imperialism. Get the economy running efficiently, and once everything is stable and safe, then you ease up the reins and let it all go. But of course, Stalin dies before he could do that. And Gorbachev has been living in the complacent era. He grew up in the complacent era and hasn't been a strong authoritarian leader in a long time. And the idea of bringing that back now is a very hard sell for a country that has already lost so much faith. And again, the corruption is endemic. And if you try that, there's a good chance, you just get killed or overthrown anyway. So, to be fair to Gorbachev, he's got a pretty hard job laid out for him here. And he decides, of course, to go for the second option, to ease up all of the authoritarianism, to ease up from central authority, let people have more autonomy, let people have more freedom. But at the same time, he's trying to push an anti-corruption agenda, which just doesn't work if you ease up your own central authority. Nonetheless, he does his best. All of these reforms are known as perestroika in this period. That's the term for restructuring the planning of the whole economy, opening up the economy, opening up markets, letting people have more autonomy and freedom, and easing up on the whole central control. It was probably the only thing that was going to stop the floodgates of corruption, and now that's gone. But as far as Gorbachev's concerned, that's a problem for later, because we got a more immediate problem, which is the rebellions happening all over the alliance. And it's at this point, I think, the final nail in the Soviet coffin hits, because whether perestroika would have worked or not, it's hard to say, because only a few months after they started, the next massive crisis to hit the Soviet Union happens, which is the explosion at reactor number 4 in Chernobyl. And this is just a calamity on a whole other level. I'm not going to go too deep into it, because Chernobyl's also one of those subjects like the Second World War. If you get me going about it, we're going to be here all day. And I'm pretty sure this podcast is already long enough as it is. But the bottom line is it basically destroys what's left of a lot of people's faith in the Soviet Union. It's the final straw on the back of this camel, and a lot of places are going to really try and break away from the Soviet Union as a result of it. Perestroika also starts hitting its first obstacles almost straight away, because the problem with opening up the markets and opening up the freedom of everyone without dealing with all of the issues of corruption is this is really only half a reform, because it's only fixing half the problem, but it's letting the other half of the problem spiral out of control. All the mechanisms of this planned economy were based on this central planning as well, and that's now gone out the window, and there's confusion everywhere about what people are supposed to be doing, what their expectations are, and the decentralization of a lot of the economic decisions causes massive confusion everywhere, especially because there's no hard budget constraints everywhere. No one really knows what's going on. People are raising wages for their workers everywhere without knowing what the budget adjustments are going to be yet. So spending starts getting out of control in all sorts of sectors, and that's increasing the inflation for the ruble. It's just getting really out of control. Yeah, you're giving people some freedom back, but it is absolute fucking chaos as a result of that. And although giving people freedom was supposed to inspire some more confidence in the Central Committee, it actually has the opposite effect, because as you outsource a lot of that power, a lot of people are looking at the Central Committee going, what do we need you for anymore? And the whole thing just starts to break down. In 1987, Gorbachev has one last card he thinks he can play to salvage and manage the situation that is quickly spiraling out of control. It's his policy of glasnost, which is basically truth-telling. The idea that they're going to ease up on a lot of the censorship and let news stations and newspapers and journalists and anyone really to speak the truth about Soviet history and about what's going on within the Soviet government now. It's about transparency and letting people see what's really been going on. This is a very dangerous thing to do for a government that is already teetering on illegitimacy and that everyone is losing faith in. But there is a logic to this, and I didn't really get this when I first learned about glasnost, but when I was reading some of these books, it ticked and said, that's actually kind of clever. The intention behind glasnost is an anti-corruption measure. Gorbachev is gambling that if they can talk openly and de-censor a lot of the way the news talks about the Soviet government, they're going to expose a lot of mistakes from the past that were covered up, especially during Stalin's era. But also, they're going to be able to openly report the corruption that's happening now. And that's going to help Gorbachev go after some of the corrupt officials and hopefully rein in the corruption. And Gorbachev's not a fool. For all his faults, he's not a fool. And he realizes that if glasnost goes ahead, if we open up discussion about everything the Soviet government has done in the past and is doing now, it could go one of two ways. One, it could really just destroy everyone's faith in the Soviet government by just constantly focusing on its failures and its mistakes and its errors. And that could be enough to just tip the scales and everyone goes, you know what, enough of this, let's just destroy the whole thing. But the other half of that equation is it would give him the power and the legitimacy to go after all the corrupt officials, get rid of them, and inspire faith that this government is trying to correct itself and is doing the right thing to fix the problems that are going on. And in Gorbachev's mind, this is a race against time. If he can get enough action towards the corruption and to show all the citizens of the Soviet Union and the satellite countries that they are actively looking to fix these problems, if he can do that before the disillusionment of all the things that's about to be revealed happens, well, you might just get away with it. And again, this is not just something that Gorbachev settled on, lightheartedly. There was strong debate about glasnost and whether it would do more good than harm. And again, to Gorbachev's credit, I think his intentions were always good. It was just terrible execution. He's saying, well, this is what we're supposed to be anyway, right? This is socialist principles. We're supposed to have a transparent government. We are supposed to let everyone know what is going on here so that everyone can make good decisions and inspire faith in the government. If you would ask Stalin about this, and I'm going to put my words in Stalin's mouth, but I reckon if you would ask Stalin about this, he would have said, yes, that is something you want to do after you have completely stabilized the state. It is not something you would ever want to do with the intention of trying to stabilize the state. Because do you know what's going to happen? Well, Gorbachev's about to find out. He is completely wrong in this estimation. And not only does it not inspire confidence in the Soviet government, it destroys what little faith a lot of people still had in it. And remember, the glory days of the Soviet Union are long gone by this point. It has been in decline for a while, and to have the whole government and all of the news focus on the errors they have made and the mistakes they have made and the disasters they have covered up, this just dominates the news cycle. It dominates discussion everywhere. It is very destabilizing to the entire entity, to all the satellite states, to everything. It will lead to far more rebellions. It will lead to bigger protests, and it will see Gorbachev lose control of his own narrative. By 1989, the Soviet Union is mortally wounded, and the Eastern European states start to break away from the Soviet orbit. Poland will break away, Hungary will break away, East Germany will break away, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. Then by 1990, Lithuania will break away, Latvia will break away, Estonia will break away, and all of them will declare independence. And on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolves. And I've heard this is one of the saddest moments in world history, in my opinion. I also think it's one of the Soviet Union's finest hours, because it revealed the true spirit of socialism. Because when these countries started to break away, it would have been very easy for the Central Committee to send the tanks in and crush these rebellions. They could have destroyed the nationalist forces, they could have oppressed the people, they could have declared martial law, they could have stopped this from happening, at least for a while, but it would have required massive violence against civilian populations to do it. And it is so extremely important to note that the Soviet Union does not do that. They see these countries breaking away, and as true socialists, as corrupt and as bad as things have become in the Soviet Union, they are presented with the moral decision: do we crush our own people to save this government, or do we let these people live in peace? And do we honor their decisions, which as socialists is one of the things we believe in? And this is a moment they exercise one of the best decisions they ever made, and they decide not to crush these rebellions. And they come to the decision that if the people want to rise up and break away from the Soviet Union, well, then that's their right and their choice to do that. And it's so important to note that in this entire period, when the Soviet Union finally collapses, there aren't any big trials for generals that abuse their power. There weren't throwing open the gates of the gulags and going, look at all the victims of people in here. There's no one put on trial. There's no Nuremberg-style trial like you saw at the end of the Nazi era or the end of the fascist era. No one goes on trial. Everyone just ends it. And the Soviet Union doesn't go out in a hail of violence, which is a hallmark of every empire that dies, by the way. When the British Empire was dying in the early 1950s, it hits one of the most violent periods of its entire existence. It commits genocide in Kenya, in India, in Malaysia, desperately trying to hold on to the empire as it collapses. You saw the French do the same thing when the French Empire was collapsing. They committed genocide in Algeria and in Vietnam, trying to save on to their dying empire. You can see the United States doing it right now. They're committing genocide in Palestine. Israel and the United States are the same entity, to be honest. They're committing genocide in Gaza. They're trying to genocide Iran. They are just going supernova violent while the US empire is in decline. The Soviet Union doesn't do any of that because the Soviet Union wasn't an empire. It was the first socialist government trying to liberate people and to bring about the creation of a communist state. And no one had ever attempted that before, and they had to make it up as they went along. They had all the theory, but they had no experience until they started it. And the Soviet Union makes a lot of mistakes all the way through it. But it's so important to remember that they went to extreme efforts trying to fix those mistakes, which is something you never see capitalist countries do. Capitalist countries only care about profit, and they don't care how many people get hurt in the process. They don't care how many people have to die to save their empires. That's all that matters, is the profit. But the Soviet Union was never like that. The Soviet Union genuinely tried to uplift people. It did uplift people. And as Parenti pointed out in our first quote when we started this, never before or since the Soviet Union have we ever seen the standard of living of people ever rise at that rate, ever. It was a truly amazing accomplishment, and I think the collapse of the Soviet Union is one of the biggest tragedies in all of human history, because the world is an infinitely worse place without it. Because once the Soviet Union was gone, the capitalist countries didn't have to pretend to care about their people anymore. So long as the Soviet Union, so long as the Second World existed, there was always an alternative to the capitalist exploitation, to the capitalist empires. And the capitalist empires knew that, and they had to adopt their own versions of socialist policies to keep their people happy. The reason we have things like weekends and paid leave, and in some capitalist countries, universal healthcare and free education, was because of the Soviet Union. The fact that it existed and it was offering these things to its people meant that a lot of capitalist countries were like, well, we better adopt these too so our people don't have a socialist uprising against our capitalist government. But now that the Soviet Union is gone, a lot of that pressure is gone from the capitalist countries, and all of those border countries, the Polands and the Hungaries and Yugoslavias and all these countries that broke away from the Soviet Union at the end, one of their main motivations is, all those younger generations had always known security, like social security. They always had housing, they always had education, they always had healthcare, they always had food. Quality of all those things might be mid-tier, but they were guaranteed and they were cheap. And all of these people who grew up after the revolution just took that for granted. We just have these things. That's just how the world is. And they look over at the West and go, we want all the things we have under socialism. We just want the nice cars and a nice fashion and all of that stuff as well. They didn't realize that when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did all that security. So yes, they got access to the high-paying jobs, and they got access to the BMWs and all the glitz and the glamour and the culture and all that, but they also lost their healthcare, and they lost their cheap housing, and they lost their free education. And, well, we already know what the world is like now, living under a completely capitalist society. It is nightmarish, especially now as we enter end-stage capitalism and the decline of the US empire. So yes, I do believe that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the biggest tragedies, and everyone in the world has had to feel the consequences of that. And when we look at the decline of the Soviet Union, you can't help but ask the question that started this entire podcast, which is, if things were so great under the Soviet Union, then how did it collapse? And just as importantly, how do you stop that from happening again? One of the good things about living in the 2020s here is, for us, that's not a theoretical thing, because we already know how you solve those issues, because there's a country that went down the same trajectory as the Soviet Union, but they did it a few years later. So it's almost like they got to live in the future and see what was going to happen. When they saw the issues of the Soviet Union starting to well up, they had a bit more time to prepare counters for those issues and those crises that came up. And they did exactly that. And now they are the strongest country in the entire world. The reason communist China has done so well and avoided all of the problems that the Soviet Union succumbed to is because they got to watch what was happening to the Soviet Union ahead of their own development, because China is like 10 years behind the Soviet Union in terms of just going through every single step. They had to industrialize the country and everything. And they got to watch what was happening to the Soviet Union unfold in real time. And when they saw the catastrophes of the corruption setting in, and they saw the catastrophes of the stagnating economy and perestroika and glasnost, China did not make those same mistakes. And they learnt from those mistakes. And, well, you can look at China now as the greatest success story of socialism of all time. They are one of the most remarkable countries that has ever existed, and all of their accomplishments and the way they managed to turn China from a broken, war-torn country that was ruled by warlords in different provinces, that had an almost entirely agrarian population with no literacy, no industrialization of any kind, and over 1 billion people with different cultures and different languages. And socialism managed to bring all of those people together. It managed to educate them, it managed to house them, it managed to give them all jobs, and it created its own 5-year plans with all of the lessons that the Soviet Union had already taught them. And in only like 60 years, China went from just an absolutely devastated land ruled by warlords into the finest and strongest country in the entire world, unified under socialism, and is still well and truly on track to eventually reach its goal of full communism. And in all likelihood, will be the first country to actually do that. I guess we'll find out in the coming years and decades, because China, of course, still faces the same problem that the Soviet Union faced its entire existence, which is that it needed to have that big military and always just have the focus on national security, because the capitalist nations were always looking for any opportunity to destroy it. With the imminent fall of the United States empire, and with it most of the power behind the capitalist empire around the world, China will be by far the strongest country in the world, a socialist country, and it won't have that fear anymore. It will actually be able to prosper without the fear of invasion. No one will be able to defeat China. They already can't, to be honest. But without the constant threat of capitalist imperialism, you'll be able to see socialism in its finest form, where it doesn't have to worry about its survival and can just focus on improving the lives of its people and refining the theory with practice and learning the best ways to run a planned economy and the best ways to run a country to help the most amount of people as much as it can, and to always be refining itself into a finer version, and always with the eyes on the prize of creating a full communist nation. And it's something that I really hope we will see in our lifetime. For all its faults and for all its mistakes, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Soviet Union, because it did a lot of things right and it did a lot of things wrong, but all of the lessons are invaluable. And I think when capitalism does eventually fall, or at least the empires of capitalism finally fall, the worldview of the Soviet Union will be vindicated. I think it'll be viewed in a much different light to the way we view it now, when we have, billionaires and capitalists that are constantly bombarding us and drowning us in anti-communist and anti-socialist propaganda. I think eventually history will see the accomplishments of the Soviet Union as the amazing accomplishments they are. And I think it is only a matter of time before the whole world eventually adopts socialism as its main political and economic force, and the world will be a better place for it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the Triploi podcast. It was a long one, this one. I've been recording this, like just the raw recordings, for like 7 hours now, and my throat hurts. I can yap, that is for sure. Especially when it's a topic that I'm particularly passionate about, which of course is 20th century history and the Soviet Union specifically. I really enjoyed recording this one, and I really hope you enjoyed it too. If you are a fan of the Triploi podcast, I would like to ask 2 little favors of you. The first is tell someone about this podcast. Word of mouth is by far the best way I can actually grow an audience. So if you tell a friend or a family member about this, and hopefully, they can learn something from it, then that would be great. The other thing is, please become a subscriber to my Patreon. A free subscriber is enough, because that just helps me grow the audience as well, and it gets you on the mailing list and things like that. But I'm going to add one more little additional request, and I've never done this before, and it really pains me to do it because I don't find it. I struggle with self-promotion. I just don't like it. I find it icky. But I put a ton of effort into these podcasts and into the videos, and they take a huge amount of my time. So I do have a paid tier on Patreon. It's only $2. I refuse to do more than that now. But if you think I give you $2 worth of content a month, I would very much like to have that $2 if you are able to do so. I will always release this content for free. I will always do this content. I'm not going to stop regardless, because I think this education is important. I especially think it's important in this day and age. And I'm going to do it anyway because I think it's valuable to do. But if you think that it's worth $2, I would really appreciate it. So something for you to consider. But nonetheless, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll do a poll soon to decide what our next topic is. I've got one on my mind that I really want to do anyway. way, but I won't make that decision. I'll let you guys make that decision, and that'll be on the Patreon too. I'll do a poll there soon. Nonetheless, hope you've enjoyed this one. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully this has given you something to think about.